Eleanor Whitmore did not cry when they laughed at her. She had already used up every tear she had in Ohio standing in front of a mirror the morning she turned 27, wearing the only good dress she owned, trying to believe she was worth the train ticket she'd spent her last savings on. She stepped off that train in Silver Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1878, and the whole platform went cruel and quiet in the same breath. Then she heard it, a voice that had never once spoken her name, and yet somehow said it like it was the only word in the English language that mattered. If this story already has your heart, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Silver Creek, because what happens next is something this town never saw coming. Eleanor Whitmore gripped the handle of her suitcase so hard her knuckles went white, and she told herself the same thing she had told herself every single morning for the past 3 years, that she was not going to let them see her flinch. She had practiced this. On the train in the dark, while the mountains rose up outside the window, like something out of a dream she didn't quite trust herself to have. She had rehearsed how she would hold her shoulders, how she would breathe, how she would walk off that platform with her chin level and her eyes clear, and give no one, not a single soul in Silver Creek, Colorado, the satisfaction of watching her shrink. But the moment her foot hit the wooden platform, the air on that station changed. She felt it before she heard it. That particular silence that isn't really silence at all, the kind that fills itself up with held breath and sideways glances, and the deliberate, almost theatrical pause before cruelty decides to make itself comfortable. Then the whispers started. Lord Almighty, is that her? That can't be the woman from the letter. She must weigh near 300 pounds. Poor Nathaniel. He must not have asked for a portrait. And then the laughter. Low at first, the kind people try to keep behind their hands, because they still want to believe they have manners. Then wider, spreading through the gathered crowd the way a fire moves through dry grass, fast, thoughtless, hungry. A man near the water barrel said it loud enough that 3 women beside him covered their mouths and giggled like schoolgirls who'd been given permission. She's bigger than a bull. Eleanor did not stop walking. She had heard that her whole life. In Ohio, in the schoolyard at her mother's church at the market in Dayton, where she'd worked the counter for 6 years and still managed to hear it muttered by someone every single week she was there. She had heard it from men who thought they were being funny, and women who thought they were being honest, and children who didn't know any better, and adults who absolutely did. She had heard it so many times it had started to sound less like an insult and more like a sentence. Like something decided about her before she ever got to open her mouth. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. She was 27 years old. She had grown up in a 2-room house outside Columbus with a mother who worked herself into an early grave, and a father who left before Eleanor was old enough to understand what leaving meant. She had never been to a dance. Never been courted. Never had a man tip his hat to her on the street and mean it as anything other than mockery. She was a large woman, nearly 280 pounds, broad-shouldered, with strong hands that had never been soft a day in her life. She had a round, gentle face and dark brown eyes that people rarely bothered to look into because they stopped at everything else first. She had answered Nathaniel Carter's advertisement in a Columbus paper 3 months ago. Not because she was desperate. She told herself that every time the doubt crept in. She had answered because of one line. One single line buried in the middle of a plainly written notice from a Colorado mountain rancher who needed a wife and wasn't pretending otherwise. I do not need a perfect woman. I need someone with courage enough to survive beside me. She had read that line standing at Mrs. Albright's kitchen table, where she boarded, and something in her chest had moved. Not cracked open dramatically, not burst into some great flowering hope, just shifted. Like a stone turning over in a riverbed. Quiet. Significant. She had written back that same evening. He had written back within the week. His letters were not romantic. They were careful and plain and honest in a way she wasn't used to from people who wanted something from her. He told her about the ranch, the cattle, the mountain winters, the isolation, the fact that his first wife had died 4 years ago of fever, and the silence had become something he was no longer willing to live inside of. He told her what he needed. He asked what she needed. He did not ask about her appearance, and when she mentioned it herself, carefully braced for the reply, he wrote back 4 sentences. I appreciate you telling me. A woman willing to name hard things is a woman I can trust. I have my own hard things. We can be honest with each other. 4 sentences. She had folded that letter and put it inside her dress and worn it against her skin for 2 days. So she had come. She had come with 1 suitcase and $17 and a letter in her pocket, and she had told herself she was not going to let anyone on that platform make her feel like she was already a failure before she'd even said her name. But the laughter kept coming. A woman near the general store doorway said something to the woman beside her and didn't bother to lower her voice. Nathaniel's gone and done it now. What on earth was he thinking? She can't even look at her. She can barely manage the steps. Eleanor had managed the steps just fine. She managed them every day. She had managed stairs and ladders and creek banks and everything else her life had required her to manage with a body that the world decided was a problem before she got a vote in the matter. She kept her eyes forward. She kept walking. She was nearly to the end of the platform when the crowd shifted, and she felt it before she saw it. That change in pressure, the way people move when someone of significance moves through them. A man came through the crowd. Tall. Dark-haired, starting to go silver at the temples. Built the way mountain country builds men, not for show, but for endurance. He wore a plain brown coat and dusty boots, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had not once in his adult life felt the need to perform for an audience. The crowd parted for him, the way crowds part for men they respect, without quite knowing why. He walked directly toward Eleanor. Not past her, not toward the station door behind her, toward her. He stopped 2 feet away, and he removed his hat, and he looked at her. Not the way the rest of the town looked at her, not cataloging and calculating and finding her wanting. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been expecting and is relieved to finally see. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. His voice was low and unhurried. It didn't perform. It just landed. Welcome home. The platform went dead quiet. Not the cruel quiet from before. A different kind. The kind that happens when the room realizes it has been caught doing something shameful. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared herself for disappointment. She had prepared herself for the polite grimace, the too quick smile, the brief and telling hesitation before manners assembled themselves over whatever his real reaction was. She had survived enough first impressions to know exactly what they felt like when a person's face tried to be kind about what their eyes already decided. Nathaniel Carter's face did none of those things. He held his hat in both hands, and he waited, and the only thing in his expression was patience. Mr. Carter, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He nodded once, then offered his arm. She took it, and they walked off that platform together, while half of Silver Creek stared and the other half looked away, and Eleanor Whitmore kept her chin level and her eyes clear and gave no one the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Not then. Not once. The road from town to the Carter Ranch wound up into the mountain foothills for nearly 4 miles, and Nathaniel drove the wagon in a silence that Eleanor found unexpectedly comfortable rather than strained. She had spent her life learning the difference. Uncomfortable silences filled themselves with other people's discomfort, with the need to perform ease, or explain yourself, or make someone else feel better about being around you. This silence was different. It was simply 2 people occupying the same space without requiring anything particular from each other. She looked at the mountains. She had never seen mountains before, not real ones. The hills outside Columbus were gentle and green, and entirely unsurprising. These were something else altogether enormous, and indifferent and magnificent, wearing their first snow at the peaks like they'd been there since before the word Colorado existed. They're bigger than I expected, she said. Most things out here are, Nathaniel said. She glanced at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the road, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been a smile if it decided to commit. Your letters were honest, she said. I appreciated that. I don't have the patience for the other kind." He paused. "You were honest too, about yourself. That took something." "It took less than you'd think," she said. "I've spent enough years having other people be dishonest about me. Figured I might as well get there first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The town will give you trouble." I noticed. "It won't stop right away." "I didn't expect it to." He looked at her then, briefly. "Good," he said, and returned his eyes to the road. The ranch appeared around the last bend in a way that felt less like an arrival and more like a revelation. Not because it was beautiful in any polished sense, but because it was real. A main house built from dark timber with a porch that listed slightly to the left. A barn. A bunkhouse where two ranch hands were already watching the wagon approach with open curiosity. Fence lines running up into the lower hillside. Cattle in the distance, small and dark against the pale autumn grass. It was not wealthy, it was working. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help. Not out of stubbornness, but out of habit, and because the wagon step was low enough that waiting for help would have been more performance than practicality, and she stood in the yard and looked at all of it. "What needs doing first?" she said. Nathaniel blinked. She got the sense that wasn't the question he'd been expecting. "The roof on the east side of the barn," he said after a moment. "Before the first real snow. The main house larder needs stocking. One of the ranch hands, Billy the younger one, broke 3 fingers last week, and he's more liability than help right now. And the books haven't been properly kept since March." "I can manage books," she said. "And larder stocking. The roof I'll need to learn." "You don't need to." "What did your letter say?" she asked. He stopped. "You said you needed someone with courage enough to survive beside you," she said. "Not someone to keep the house warm while you do the surviving. Beside you." Another silence. And then something happened in Nathaniel Carter's expression that she didn't have a word for, yet something that would take her months to fully recognize and name, something that looked from the outside almost like relief. "Billy can show you the roof situation in the morning," he said. "Come inside. I'll show you the books tonight." She followed him into the house. The 2 ranch hands, Billy with his bandaged hand, and an older man named Amos, who moved with the deliberate economy of someone whose joints had strong opinions, both touched their hat brims when she came through the yard. Billy stared a little. Amos didn't stare at all, which Eleanor decided immediately made him her favorite person on the property. The inside of the house was plain and clean, in the way of a man who is not messy by nature, but doesn't know what to do with empty wall space. A large stone fireplace. A kitchen table worn smooth from years of use. A shelf of books, more than she'd expected, and a stack of ledgers on the desk by the window that she could see from across the room were in the kind of organizational state that would have given her mother a headache. "I'll start on those tonight," she said, nodding at the ledgers. "After supper," Nathaniel said. "After supper," she agreed. She cooked that first night from what was in the larder. Nothing complicated, a stew that needed longer than she had, but came out passable, and the 4 of them sat at the table together. Nathaniel and Amos and Billy and Eleanor. And it was strange, and not quite comfortable, and entirely unlike anything she'd experienced before. And she thought, this is what the beginning of something feels like. Not warm yet, not safe yet, just real. Billy, eating his second bowl, said, "You ride Mrs. Whitmore." "No," she said. "You want to learn?" "Yes." He nodded like that was the correct answer, and went back to his stew. Amos said nothing all through dinner, and when he finished he stood up, put his bowl in the dry sink, touched the brim of his hat in her direction and said, "Good stew, ma'am," and went out. Eleanor decided she had been right about him. After dinner she sat at the desk with the ledgers, while Nathaniel sat at the table with what appeared to be a surveying map, and neither of them spoke for 2 hours, and it was, Eleanor thought, the most companionable evening she could remember having in years. She had not expected that. She was not sure what she had expected. Something more formal, maybe. More awkward. More of the careful, exhausting performance that happened when 2 strangers tried to convince each other that sharing space was fine, actually perfectly fine. Nothing strange here at all. Instead, it was just two people doing the work in front of them in the same room without requiring the other to comment on it. She liked it. She went to bed that night in the small room off the kitchen. They had not discussed arrangements, and she did not expect them to. This was a practical arrangement, and it would move at a practical pace, and she lay in the dark, listening to the mountain wind move against the house, and she thought about the platform at Silver Creek, and the laughter, and the way Nathaniel Carter had walked through that crowd, without looking left or right, and taken off his hat and said, "Welcome home," like it was the simplest true thing in the world. She thought, maybe I did not make a mistake. She slept. The first month was harder than the second, and the second was harder than the third. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Eleanor stopped measuring difficulty and started measuring progress instead, because that was the only accounting that made any practical sense. She fell off a horse for the first time on a Thursday morning in October in front of Billy and Amos, and a fence post that she was fairly certain was smirking at her, and she got up out of the dirt and put her foot back in the stirrup, and the horse, a broad roan mare named Consequence, which Eleanor thought was either a very good name for a horse or a warning she should have heeded, shifted sideways and dumped her again. Billy said carefully, "You might want to—" "I know," Eleanor said from the ground. "She does that when she feels the rider tense up. I know that now. If you just— Billy." She stood, brushed the dirt from her dress, and looked at him. "I am going to get back on this horse. I am going to keep getting back on this horse until one of us decides we understand each other. You can either help me or go fix that fence section near the creek that Amos says has been listing since September." Billy looked at the fence, looked at Eleanor, looked at Consequence. "I'll help you," he said. By the end of October, she could ride. Not well, not with anything approaching grace or confidence. But she could stay on the horse, and she could direct it in the general direction she intended, and Consequence had stopped trying to deposit her in the dirt with quite so much enthusiasm, which Eleanor chose to interpret as the beginning of mutual respect. She burned 3 meals and oversalted 2 more before she calibrated to the altitude and the different behavior of the wood stove and the particular unpredictability of the larder's supply schedule. She made a list of everything they needed and a second list of everything they had, and found a third list tucked inside the front cover of the oldest ledger in a woman's handwriting. Neat, careful, practical. A supply inventory dated 1873. Nathaniel's first wife. Eleanor closed the ledger and set it aside for a moment, and she sat with that, with the weight of the woman who had sat at this same desk and made this same list, and then 4 years ago simply wasn't there anymore. And she let herself feel the sadness of it without trying to organize it away. Then she opened the ledger again and started on the accounts from March, because the list needed to be updated and the books needed to be set right, and she was here to do work. And sometimes work was also a form of respect. She fixed the books. It took 3 evenings and revealed that the ranch was not failing so much as it was disorganized, that there were resources Nathaniel hadn't been tracking, and expenses he'd stopped logging, and a pattern of missed opportunities in the cattle sale timing that had been quietly costing him money for 2 years running. She laid it out at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, the ledger and a sheet of her own figures side by side, and Nathaniel sat across from her and read through it without speaking. Then he said, "How did you know to look at the sale timing?" "My mother kept the books for a dry goods store for 11 years, Eleanor said. "I watched her. She always said the numbers don't lie, but they don't always speak up either. Sometimes you have to ask them the right questions." He looked at her figures again. "If we shift the fall sale by 3 weeks, he said slowly, you capture the late season premium. Yes, it's not guaranteed, but the last 4 years the price differential in that window has been consistent enough that it's worth the planning." He was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn this?" he said. And it wasn't a suspicious question, it was a genuine one. The kind of question a person asks when they've discovered something existed that they hadn't known to look for. "I had a great deal of time," Eleanor said, "and very little else to do with it. I read anything I could get my hands on. I watched how people managed things. I paid attention." She paused. "Most people didn't expect me to be paying attention. That made it easier." Nathaniel studied her with those quiet, direct eyes of his. "Most people are fools," he said. Coming from him, it wasn't a grand declaration. It was just a statement of observable fact. But something in Eleanor's chest shifted at it anyway, that same small, quiet movement like a stone turning in a riverbed, and she said, "Sometimes," and they went back to looking at the figures. It was sometime in November. She wasn't sure exactly when time moved differently. In the mountain country measured more in weather and workload than calendar pages, that she noticed the town's relationship with her had begun to stratify. There were those who had decided she was beneath their acknowledgement and intended to maintain that position regardless of evidence. She saw them in town on supply runs, the woman from the station platform, a man named Hollis Greer, who seemed to operate the general store primarily as a vehicle for his own opinions, and they looked through her, or past her, with the practiced ease of people who had elevated their own prejudices into something that felt to them like principle. There were those who had moved from open mockery to simple avoidance, not hostile, not kind, just absent, as though if they didn't look directly at her, she couldn't quite fully exist. And then there were those who had started quietly and without fanfare to look at her differently. The wife of the blacksmith, a woman named Louisa Pratt, had stopped Eleanor on her second supply run to say abruptly, a little awkwardly, like someone who had been building up to it for a while, that she'd heard Eleanor had got consequence under control and that horse had thrown 3 men before her, and she said it not as a compliment exactly, but as an acknowledgement, the way people acknowledge facts that surprise them. Eleanor had said, "She's a smart horse. She just needed to know I wasn't going to panic." And Louisa Pratt had said, and gone back into her husband's shop, but she'd nodded at Eleanor the next time she saw her in town, and the time after that, and Eleanor understood that this was how respect moved in small communities, not in speeches, but in increments. What she had not expected was Caleb Carter. Nathaniel had mentioned his brother in passing, younger by 8 years, moved away several years ago. No further detail offered in a way that made the absence of detail itself informative. She'd understood there was a complicated history there without asking about it, because some things you learn to read in the silences between what people say. She was not prepared for the man who rode onto the ranch property on a cold morning in early December and tied his horse at the post and walked into the yard like he owned it. He was Nathaniel's brother only in the technical biological sense. Where Nathaniel was deliberate, Caleb was quick moving, quick smiling, quick to fill every available moment with sound. He was younger and softer looking, and dressed with the kind of careful attention to appearance that immediately made Eleanor distrust him, because in her experience, men who worried that much about how they looked rarely had time to worry about anything else. He stopped when he saw her. The smile didn't drop, but it recalibrated, just slightly, just enough for Eleanor to see it happen. "Well," he said, "you must be the new Mrs. Carter." "I'm not yet," Eleanor said. "We haven't married. We're keeping to a proper arrangement for the present." "Oh." He processed this, recalibrated again. "Well, you must be the woman from Ohio then." "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "And you're Caleb. Nathaniel mentioned me." He mentioned a brother. Something moved in Caleb's expression at that, a flicker of something that wasn't quite hurt and wasn't quite anger, closer to assessment. "Where's my brother?" he said. "North pasture," she said. "He'll be back by noon. You're welcome to wait in the house if you like. There's coffee on." She said it the way she'd have said it to anyone, plain practical, neither warm nor cold. He followed her inside, and she poured him coffee and went back to the biscuit dough she'd been working before he arrived. And she felt his eyes on her the entire time, with the focused attention of a man cataloging something he intends to use later. "You seem comfortable here," he said. "I am comfortable here," she said. "I find that's generally a choice." "Nathaniel treating you well? Mr. Carter is a fair and decent man," she said. "Yes. He can be." Caleb wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and leaned back in his chair with the elaborate ease of someone who wanted to appear relaxed. "He can also be stubborn as a mule and twice as difficult to move once he's made up his mind about something. You find that yet? I've found he's consistent, she said. I find that's generally a virtue. Caleb smiled. It was a perfectly pleasant smile. Eleanor didn't trust it even slightly. You're not what I expected, he said. I rarely am, she said. I meant that as a compliment. I know how you meant it, she said. She turned back to her biscuit dough and he sat in her kitchen, and she kept her eyes on her work and her attention on him with the full practiced awareness of a woman who had spent 27 years learning to know when a room had a threat in it. Nathaniel arrived at noon, and the two brothers met in the yard with the careful, contained distance of men who share blood and history and not much else at the present moment. She watched from the kitchen window without appearing to watch. She saw Nathaniel's jaw set when he first saw Caleb's horse. She saw the brief assessing exchange before anything warm entered either of their faces. She heard Caleb say through the window she'd cracked for the heat from the stove. She's interesting, Nate. I'll give you that. And Nathaniel said, she's capable. You might try noticing that instead. And Caleb said with another one of those perfectly pleasant smiles, Oh, I noticed everything, brother. Don't worry about that. Eleanor pressed the biscuits into their pan and put them in the oven, and she thought, there it is. She thought, he came to look. Now he's figured out what he can use. She didn't know yet exactly what he intended. But she knew with the certainty of someone who had learned very early to read the rooms and the people in them and the silences in between. She knew that Caleb Carter's arrival in Silver Creek was not going to make anything easier. She also knew something else. She had not traveled 400 miles and fallen off a horse 11 times and corrected 2 years of disorganized ledgers and earned the grudging nod of Louisa Pratt and the quiet trust of Amos and the slightly less grudging cooperation of a horse named Consequence, to be undone by a man with a pleasant smile and careful eyes who'd decided she was a problem he could solve. She was not a problem. She was Eleanor Whitmore. And she was as she had been her whole life, just getting started. Caleb stayed 3 days that first visit, and every hour of those 3 days, he was doing what Eleanor had recognized him doing from the first 5 minutes, building something. Not loudly, not obviously. He was charming to the ranch hands, and deferential to Nathaniel in public, and he helped with fence work, and never once said anything directly unkind about Eleanor in anyone's hearing. But he asked questions, the kind that seemed casual and were not. He asked Billy how Eleanor managed with the cattle. He asked Amos how she handled the kitchen stores. He asked Nathaniel in the evenings when Eleanor was at the desk with the ledgers whether she was finding it hard, whether she'd said anything about going back to Ohio, whether she seemed happy. All of it framed as concern. All of it aimed at finding the crack. Eleanor knew because Amos told her. Not in a grand speech. Amos was not a man for grand speeches. He came into the kitchen on the second morning of Caleb's visit, set his coffee cup in the dry sink, and said without preamble, "He's asking questions about you." "I know," Eleanor said. "Telling folk in town your arrangement isn't proper." "Is that what he's saying?" "Saying Nathaniel was lonely and you took advantage. Saying you came out here for security." Amos picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "Thought you should know." "Thank you, Amos," she said. He touched the brim and went out. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the mountains, which were doing what mountains do. Sitting there enormous and entirely unimpressed by human drama. And she made herself breathe through the first surge of anger. Because anger was not what this situation required. Not yet. And she was not going to react in the way Caleb was probably hoping she'd react, which was loudly and defensively, which would prove his point for him. She was going to be patient. She was going to be effective. She was going to wait. Caleb left on the morning of the third day, and when he rode out, he shook Nathaniel's hand and tipped his hat at Eleanor and smiled that perfectly pleasant smile, and Eleanor smiled back perfectly pleasantly. And then he was gone down the mountain road, and she went back inside and sat at the desk and opened the ledgers. "He's going to be trouble," Nathaniel said from the doorway. "He already is," Eleanor said without looking up. A pause. "You heard?" "Amos told me." Another pause longer this time. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. Nathaniel Carter was not a man who found words easy. She'd understood that from the first letter the way he chose them, carefully put them down and left them there, didn't ornament them or apologize for them. He stood in the doorway now with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, and he looked at her with those direct, quiet eyes. "I don't want you to think," he started, then stopped, then tried again. "What he's saying, it's not what I think." "I know," she said. "I want to be sure you know." She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had walked through a crowd of cruel laughter and taken off his hat and meant every word of what he'd said. "Nathaniel," she said. "I know." He nodded once, put his hat back on, went back out to work. And Eleanor turned back to the ledgers, and the mountains held their position outside the window, and Silver Creek sat down in the valley, doing whatever Silver Creek was going to do. And Eleanor Whitmore thought, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, and was no longer remotely interested in anyone's surprise about it. "Do your worst. Caleb Carter, you have no idea who you are dealing with." The winter came down off the mountains like it had a grudge. Not gradually, the way winters moved in Ohio, that slow gray settling that gave you time to prepare and complain and prepare some more. This came fast and mean and total, the way everything in mountain country seemed to operate on its own schedule, without apology, without any particular interest in what you'd planned for the week. Eleanor had been on the Carter Ranch exactly 6 weeks when the first real snow hit, and she learned something important about herself. In the first hour of it, she was not afraid of the cold. She was not afraid of the dark. It brought with it the way the light died before 5 o'clock, and the mountains became shapes you heard rather than saw. She was not afraid of the isolation, the way Silver Creek disappeared below them into something theoretical, something that existed in memory rather than reach. What she was afraid of, and she'd spent most of those 6 weeks trying not to examine it too directly, was the particular vulnerability of needing something she hadn't needed to name yet. She was afraid of beginning to trust a place, beginning to trust a person, beginning to believe that the thing she'd come out here for might actually be real, because the believing was always where the damage happened. You didn't get hurt by the things you didn't let matter. She was letting this matter. That was the dangerous thing she noticed on the morning of the first big snow, standing at the kitchen window, watching the white come down in solid curtains across the yard, listening to Nathaniel and Amos moving in the barn, listening to the cattle sound their displeasure from the south pasture. She noticed that she had stopped waiting for the thing to go wrong. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks, without quite deciding to, she had started operating as though the ranch was hers to worry about. As though the books and the biscuits and the fence line near the creek and Consequence's bad attitude about Monday mornings were all legitimate claims on her attention, because they mattered to her, not just because she'd been brought here to manage them. That scared her more than the winter did. She put on her coat and went out to help. Billy met her in the yard with his expression doing something complicated. He was still young enough that his face told you everything before he could organize it into words. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's coming down hard, you don't need to." "Which cattle are in the south pasture?" she said. He blinked. The younger stock, the ones we moved last week. And the south fence was the one Amos said needed attention back in October. "Well, yes, but..." "Billy." She looked at him. "Either walk with me or go help Amos with the barn. Pick one." He picked walking with her. The south fence had held. Barely. 2 posts leaning at angles that suggested strong opinions about the situation, and a section of wire that had pulled loose from its staples and was performing exactly as poorly as you'd expect wire to perform when it was no longer attached to anything. The young cattle were pressed against the north side of the pasture, as far from the fence problem as they could get, which Eleanor thought showed better judgment than most of the people she'd met in Silver Creek. "We need to reset those posts before it gets deeper," she said. "The ground will be frozen solid within the hour," Billy said. "Then we'd better work fast." They worked fast. Nathaniel found them there 20 minutes later, found Eleanor knee-deep in the process of manhandling a fence post back into alignment while Billy packed the base, and he stood for a moment at the pasture gate with an expression she was learning to read. Not surprise exactly. more like a man constantly revising an estimate upward and not quite keeping pace with the revision. He didn't say anything. He took off his coat, hung it on the gate post, and grabbed the post driver. The three of them worked in the snow for the better part of an hour, and nobody talked much because the wind had things to say, and they all had work to do, and when it was done, and the fence line was solid again, and the cattle had expressed their grudging approval by moving back toward the south, Nathaniel looked at Eleanor and said, "You're going to get sick working in that." Her coat was soaked through at the shoulders. Her hands were red, and her boots were wet, and she felt approximately as graceful as a woman could feel after an hour of manual fence work in a snowstorm, which was not very. "I'll change when we're done," she said. "We're done. The north pasture gate latch. Amos fixed it this morning." He looked at her steadily. "You can stop now." She opened her mouth, closed it. There was something in the way he said it. "You can stop now," that didn't land as a dismissal. It landed as something more careful than that. A permission she hadn't realized she was waiting for. She was warm. She was dry. She changed her coat. But she went back out to the barn because there was still the matter of the east stall door that swung wrong in cold weather, and somebody had to adjust the hinges, and Amos's knees were bad in the cold, and Billy's hand was still not fully right, and so it might as well be her. That was December. January was harder. Not because of the weather, though the weather did its level best. It was harder because January was when Caleb started in earnest. She learned it in pieces, the way you learn most unpleasant things, not all at once, which would at least be clean, but gradually in fragments, each one requiring you to reassemble your understanding slightly differently than you'd had it before. The first fragment came from Louisa Pratt, who stopped Eleanor on a supply run with that particular look on her face that meant she was deciding while she was talking whether she was doing the right thing by saying it. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I want you to know that what Caleb Carter has been saying about your arrangement, I don't hold with it. Neither does my husband." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "What is he saying now?" Louisa pressed her lips together. "That Nathaniel didn't know what he was agreeing to, that you led him to believe you were different, in your letters, that you weren't honest about yourself, and Nathaniel was too lonely and too stubborn to see it." She let that sit for a moment. "He's also saying," Louisa continued, dropping her voice slightly, "that the ranch books were in fine order until you got your hands on them, that you've been moving money." That one hit differently. Not because it hurt, though. It did in the way lies always hurt, when they're the specific kind, designed to undercut the exact thing you're most competent at, but because it was smart. Caleb had watched her for 3 days and identified with precision what she valued most about her own presence here. Not her cooking, or her writing, or her willingness to work in a snowstorm. Her books, her figures, the careful, organized, honest accounting that she'd been raised to treat as a form of integrity. He'd gone straight for it. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said to Louisa. "I don't know if it does any good," Louisa said, "but I thought you should know what you're up against." "It does more good than you know," Eleanor said. She did her supply run with the lie sitting inside her chest like a stone, cold and heavy, and occupying space she needed for other things. And she drove back up the mountain road, thinking about how to respond to something you couldn't address directly without appearing defensive, and how to protect something you'd built these accounts, this careful order she'd made from chaos against an accusation that specifically targeted the evidence of its own integrity. And she thought about Nathaniel, about whether he'd heard, about whether he believed it. That was the question that made her jaw tight the whole 4 miles home. She didn't ask him right away. She came in, put the supplies away, started supper, and let the evening move at its own pace, and she watched him across the table, and tried to read in his face whether anything had changed, and she found he was the same. Quiet, consistent, reaching past her for the salt with an automatic courtesy that had become habit in 6 weeks. A please and a thank you that he delivered without making a production of it, because that was simply how he operated. After supper, when Billy and Amos had gone to the bunkhouse, and it was just the two of them in the kitchen, Nathaniel at the table with his survey map, Eleanor at the desk with the ledgers, she said without turning around. Caleb's been telling people I moved money in the ranch accounts. The silence behind her changed. Who told you that? He said. Not a question exactly. Louisa Pratt, this afternoon. She kept her eyes on the ledger. I want you to know that every entry in these books is accounted for, and I can show you the receipts for every single one. Nothing has been moved hidden or altered from what I found. Eleanor. She turned around. He was looking at her with those steady eyes, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before. Something tight and controlled that she recognized after a moment as anger. Not at her. The kind of anger that lives in a man when someone he's responsible for is being lied about, and he hasn't found the right way to respond yet. I know that, he said. 2 words, but the weight of them. You didn't look at the receipts, she said. I don't need to. Nathaniel. I know who keeps honest books, he said, and I know who lies about them. I've known Caleb a great deal longer than 6 weeks. He paused. He's done this before. Not exactly this, but this pattern. Taking what someone values and making a weapon out of it. He looked down at the map. I should have warned you more directly. She turned back to the ledger. It wouldn't have changed anything, she said. I'd have still kept the books the same way. I know. Then the warning wouldn't have mattered much. A pause. And then something rare from Nathaniel Carter, a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same territory. No, he said. I reckon not. She bent over the ledger again, and the fire worked in the fireplace, and the wind pushed against the house. And Eleanor thought, all right, Caleb, you've drawn the line. Now we'll see who has the patience to wait on the other side of it. February brought a thaw, and then a refreeze, and then Caleb Carter back in Silver Creek this time, not as a visitor to the ranch, but as a presence in town, and the difference was significant. He'd been there a week before Eleanor heard about it from Billy, who'd gone in for supplies and come back with the supplies, and also a collection of second-hand accounts, which he delivered with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a young man who had been used as a message carrier without being consulted about the role. He's at the hotel, Billy said. Been buying drinks at the saloon, talking to Hollis Greer a lot. Hollis Greer, who ran the general store and its attached hive of opinion. What are they talking about? Eleanor said. Billy's ears went red. About you mostly, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm sorry. He put the supplies on the table and didn't quite look at her. He's saying Nathaniel's not well, that the ranch is going under, that you have too much influence over a man who isn't thinking straight. Eleanor set down the flour sack she was holding. Is that all? He's been talking to the bank too, Billy said very quietly. Tom, who works the assay office, he told me Caleb's been asking about the ranch deed, about what happens to a property if the owner can't manage it proper. That was the moment the whole shape of it became clear. Not rumors to embarrass her, not whispers to undermine her standing. The rumors and the whispers were just the preparation, the softening of the ground before the real work began. Caleb wanted the ranch. Had probably always wanted the ranch. And Eleanor was not just an inconvenient woman in an awkward arrangement. She was the obstacle standing between Caleb Carter and his brother, signing something over to him, because whatever else Nathaniel was, he wasn't a man anyone could easily manipulate when he had someone competent standing at his shoulder. She was the problem Caleb needed to solve. She went and told Nathaniel that same evening, and she laid it out plainly, all of it, the way she laid out figures without drama, without editorializing fact, followed by logical conclusion. When she was done, Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. He can't take the ranch, he said finally. The deed is clear. There's no legal mechanism. Not by himself, Eleanor said. But if the bank believes you're not managing the property effectively, if there's a case made that you've been making poor decisions, that your judgment is compromised, they can call the loan early. You told me in November the loan terms. He'd told her about it then, the way he'd started telling her about things not as explanations, but as shared information, because she was someone who needed to know things in order to be useful. The ranch had a land loan from the Silver Creek Federal Bank. 2 years left on the term. Reasonable interest well within manageable range given the improved financial management of the last 2 months. But a loan was a loan, and a bank was a business, and a business could be worked on by a man with enough charm and enough money to buy drinks and enough time to sit in a saloon and build a story. He'd need evidence of mismanagement, Nathaniel said. He's been constructing evidence for 2 months, Eleanor said. The money rumors, the talk about your health, the suggestion that your judgment is clouded. She paused. He's not trying to prove mismanagement. He's trying to create the impression of it. There's a difference. Nathaniel looked at her across the kitchen table. How do you know all this? He said. Because I pay attention, she said. And because I've spent 27 years watching people underestimate me, and I know what it looks like when someone is building a case for why you don't belong somewhere. Her voice stayed level. I know it very well, Nathaniel. Something moved in his face. Not pity, she'd have stood up and left if it was pity. Something more careful than pity, something more specific. What do we do? He said. Not what do I do, we. She'd noticed that. She'd been noticing it for weeks now, the way the pronoun had shifted slowly without ceremony from the careful separateness of 2 people in a new arrangement to the natural shorthand of 2 people who had, without quite deciding, started thinking in terms of a shared situation. She had not let herself examine that too closely. She examined it now briefly and then set it aside and answered the question. We make the ranch undeniably successful, she said. We get the accounts so clean and so clearly profitable that any bank examiner Caleb brings in will look at the numbers and find nothing to work with. We document everything, every sale, every improvement, every repaired fence and adjusted timber schedule. We make the evidence so solid that his story has nowhere to go. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. That's going to take work, he said. I'm aware, she said. A lot of it. Also aware. You'd be... He stopped, started again more carefully. You'd be doing most of the account work. I can manage the ranch side. But the books, the documentation, that's my part, she said simply. Let me do my part. And there it was again, that thing in his expression she'd been slowly learning the name for. The thing that wasn't surprise and wasn't relief and wasn't quite gratitude, though it had elements of all 3. She thought the right word for it might simply be recognition. The particular quality of being seen clearly by another person and not found wanting. All right, he said. They went to work. March on the Carter Ranch became something Eleanor would later think of as the month of unrelenting competence, because that was the only word for the pace they set. The accounts already improved from her first 2 months of work became meticulous. She documented everything backward, the original disorganized state of the books when she'd arrived, the specific changes she'd made the receipt. Backing every single entry, the before and after of the ranch's financial picture laid out in columns so clear they were almost aggressive about their honesty. Nathaniel threw himself into the physical side of it with the same focused intensity. Cattle that had been managed adequately before were managed precisely now. He negotiated the spring sale with the approach Eleanor had identified from the ledger patterns, the 3-week timing shift she'd suggested, and it paid off to the tune of nearly $40 above what the previous year's sale had returned. $40 was not a fortune, but it was documented. It was real. It was evidence, and Eleanor took it to the bank herself. That had been a deliberate choice. She'd discussed it with Nathaniel, and he'd agreed, though she'd seen in his expression the moment's worth of instinct that said he should be the one to go, and she'd seen him override it because he was above all a man who could revise his instincts when the revision was warranted. She walked into the Silver Creek Federal Bank on a Thursday morning in mid-March and asked to speak with the branch manager, a man named Elias Pruitt, who was known throughout town to be thorough, somewhat humorless, and constitutionally allergic to anything that wasted his time. He was exactly the right person to talk to. She laid the accounts on his desk. All of them. The current ledger, the corrected historical figures, the receipts, the sale documentation, the before and after, in columns he could read at a glance. "The Carter Ranch loan," she said. "I understand there may have been questions raised about the management of the property." Prewitt looked at the documents on his desk, looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully. "I'm not yet Mrs. Carter," she said. "That's not the point. The point is that I manage the accounts for this property, and I want you to have complete documentation of their current state." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'd also like to know if Caleb Carter has been in contact with this bank regarding the loan status." Prewitt's expression did something careful. "That's not information I can—" "I'm not asking you to breach confidence," she said. "I'm telling you that if someone has suggested to this bank that the Carter Ranch is being mismanaged, I would like those questions answered with actual numbers rather than with rumors." She nodded at the documents. "Those are actual numbers. I'd appreciate it if you'd look at them." Prewitt looked at the documents. He was quiet for a long enough time that Eleanor knew he was actually reading them rather than performing the act of reading them, which was exactly what she'd hoped for. "This is thorough work," he said finally. "Thank you," she said. "The spring sale result." He paused. "That's a meaningful improvement over the prior year." "The timing adjustment," she said. "Late season premium. Consistent 4-year pattern in the regional price data if you want to verify it against your own records." He looked at her over the documents. "You understand this business?" he said. Not admiringly exactly, more like a man making a factual observation that had shifted his internal model of the situation. "I understand numbers," she said. "Numbers don't have opinions about who's keeping them." He was quiet for another moment. "I will review these thoroughly," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. She offered her hand. He shook it, a fraction of a second's surprise, and then a firm grip, and she walked out of the Silver Creek Federal Bank and back to the wagon, and didn't allow herself to breathe fully until she was 3 blocks down the main street. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this with something close to amusement. All that careful collected performance of absolute certainty, and her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and drove back up the mountain road, and by the time the ranch came around the bend, she'd gotten herself back together. She told Nathaniel that evening. All of it exactly as it had gone. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, and when she was done he said, "You went in there alone." "Yes," she said. "You could have—" "You." "No," she said. "I couldn't have. If you'd come with me, it would have been a man defending his ranch. This way, it was the person who actually keeps the books explaining the books. Those are different conversations." She paused. "You know that." He did know that. She could see him knowing it. "He'll push back," Nathaniel said. "Caleb. When he finds out, and he will find out, he'll push harder." "I know," she said. "It might get worse before it gets better." "Things generally do," she said. And they did. April came in cold, and then suddenly violently warm the way spring came in the mountains, not as a gentle arrival, but as a weather event. And Caleb Carter's escalation arrived with the same season and approximately the same character. He'd given up on the bank approach. Eleanor never learned the specifics of what Prewitt had said to him, but the change in tactics was itself a piece of information. The bank had been a dead end, which meant the numbers had done their work, which meant the documentation had mattered, which meant that this particular avenue of attack was closed, which meant Caleb needed a different avenue. He found it in the oldest, simplest, most reliable place that small communities have always gone when they want to destroy something they don't understand. He went after her reputation directly. Not the money accusation anymore that had been diffused. Something older and meaner. He started telling people that Eleanor had run from something in Ohio, that there was a reason a woman her age alone with no family mentioned had answered an advertisement from a man she'd never met and traveled 400 miles to get away from her own life. He said it with concern in his voice. He said it as though he hated to bring it up, but felt people should know. He said it in the saloon and in the general store, and over dinners he attended in town, that perfectly pleasant smile, doing the work of making. I wonder what she was running from sound like an innocent observation rather than an accusation. Eleanor heard about it on a Tuesday from Louisa Pratt, who had at some point in the past 3 months crossed the line from reluctant informant to something that was beginning to resemble a genuine ally, and who delivered the information this time without the hesitation she'd had back in January. "He's saying there's something in your past," Louisa said. "He's not saying what. He doesn't have to." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He doesn't." "Is there?" Louisa asked, and the question was direct but not unkind. "I'm not asking out of gossip. I'm asking because if there is, it's better you know who else knows." Eleanor thought about Ohio, about the 2-room house and her mother working herself to pieces, and her father who left, and the 6 years behind the counter at the Dayton market, and the dance she never went to, and the men who laughed, and the women who pitied, and the mirror on the morning of her 27th birthday, when she'd looked at herself and made a decision. "My past is ordinary," she said. "I was poor, and I was dismissed, and I was invisible in ways I'm tired of being invisible. And I came here because one man said something honest in an advertisement, and I believed him." She met Louisa's eyes. "That's the entire history. There's nothing for Caleb to find because there's nothing hidden." Louisa looked at her for a long moment. "Then he's got nothing," she said. "He has rumors," Eleanor said. "That's what I'm dealing with." "Rumors need cooperation," Louisa said. "They need people willing to pass them along." She said it in a specific way with a specific emphasis, and Eleanor understood what she was offering. "Louisa," she said carefully. "I have a great deal of conversations in this town," Louisa said. "Comes with having a shop on the main street. People talk to me." A pause. "I've been letting Caleb Carter's version of things move around too long without anything moving the other way." Eleanor felt something she didn't quite have a word for. Not gratitude exactly, though it was related to gratitude. More like the specific warmth of discovering that someone has been paying quiet attention to your situation and decided without being asked to put their weight on your side of the scale. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "Don't thank me," Louisa said briskly. "I'm doing it because he's a liar, and I've had enough of liars in this town." She adjusted her apron. "And because you fixed my cousin's fence line accounting last month when she was too embarrassed to ask the bank for help, and you didn't charge her anything, or make her feel small about it." Eleanor remembered that. Louisa's cousin Ada, a widow with 60 acres, and a ledger that had been kept by someone who apparently believed subtraction was optional. It had taken Eleanor 2 evenings. "I didn't do it for—" "I know you didn't," Louisa said. "That's the point." She went back into her shop, and Eleanor stood on the main street of Silver Creek in the April sun and thought about how long it took to build a thing like trust in a town that had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, and how quietly it could move when it finally decided to move. She drove back up the mountain road. She was almost to the bend before the ranch when she heard the horse coming up fast behind her, too fast for the road, the hooves too urgent against the ground, and she pulled Consequence to the side and turned to look, and it was Billy riding the way young men ride when something has happened, and they haven't yet sorted out whether it's as serious as it feels. "Mrs. Whitmore." He pulled up hard. His face was gray. "It's Nathaniel." The bottom fell out of her stomach. "What happened?" she said. "The North Ridge," Billy said. "He went up to check the upper pasture fence, the one we've been worried about since the thaw, and the ground gave way on the east slope. He fell. He's conscious, but his leg—" She didn't wait for the rest of it. She turned Consequence up the road. She found him on the east slope of the North Ridge, sitting against a boulder with his leg at an angle that made her stomach clench once hard, and then she put that away and moved toward him. Amos was already there, crouched beside him, his face doing the careful, controlled thing it did when he was worried but didn't see the use in showing it. He looked up when Eleanor came through the tree line, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has been managing a situation alone and has just been joined by someone he trusts to help manage it. That registered somewhere in Eleanor's chest, and she filed it away and kept moving. "Nathaniel," she said. "I'm all right," he said immediately. "You're not," she said. Where's the pain? The leg. Just the leg. I can... He moved, and the sound he made was involuntary and brief, and told her everything she needed to know about the leg. Stop, she said. She crouched down beside Amos and looked at the leg without touching it yet. The angle. The way he was holding himself around it. Can you feel your foot? Yes. Wiggle your toes. A pause. Yes. Good. That's good. She looked at Amos. Broken or just wrenched? Broken, Amos said. Lower leg. Not the bad kind of broken. I don't think nothing coming through the skin, but broken. Eleanor sat back on her heels and thought for approximately 4 seconds, which was how long she allowed herself, and then she said, We need to splint it before we move him. I need 2 straight pieces of wood and whatever you have for binding. I've got rope, Billy said from behind her. She hadn't heard him arrive. Good. Find me wood. Amos, I need your coat. My coat? For padding. Find me wood, Billy. They found wood. She had seen splinting done exactly once watching a doctor work on a farm laborer in Ohio who'd caught his leg under a wagon wheel, and she'd watched with the particular attention she always paid to things that seemed important and impractical, to know the kind of information you stored away, because you never knew when the world was going to require it of you. She was grateful with a focused and functional gratitude that she'd paid attention that day. Nathaniel watched her work. She could feel him watching, not with pain, or not only with pain, but with that same quality of attention he'd been directing at her since October, the ongoing and careful revision of an estimate that kept coming out higher than he'd placed it before. This is going to hurt, she told him. I know. Tell me when it's too much. It won't be. Nathaniel. It won't be, he said again, and she looked at him and saw in his face that particular kind of mountain country stubbornness that she'd stopped trying to argue with 2 months ago, and she nodded once and went back to work. It hurt. She could tell by his breathing the way it went controlled and deliberate, the way a man breathes when he's decided the pain is not going to be allowed to run things, but he didn't make another sound. And when she'd finished and the splint was set, and the leg was bound as steadily as she could manage without a proper doctor's supplies, she sat back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and they had a full conversation without either of them saying anything. Can you make it to the wagon? She said. Yes. Getting him down the slope and into the wagon took 20 minutes and required all 3 of them and a level of collective physical problem-solving that left Eleanor's shoulders aching in a way that she suspected would become very colorful bruises by morning. But they got him in. She climbed up beside him, and Billy took the reins, and Amos rode ahead to the ranch to get the bunkhouse ready, and Eleanor sat beside Nathaniel in the wagon bed and kept her hand on his arm, not holding it just there, a point of contact steady and consistent, the whole 4 miles home. He didn't say anything for most of it. Then, halfway down the mountain road, with the ranch beginning to appear below them in the fading afternoon light, he said, Caleb's going to hear about this. I know, she said. He'll use it. I know that too. Nathaniel turned his head to look at her. His face was drawn with pain, and something else underneath it, something darker. Eleanor, if he goes to the bank now, if he tells them I can't manage the physical work of the ranch, then the bank will look at the books, she said, which I have already made sure they know very well, which show a profitable, well-managed property with an improved financial picture and a successfully completed spring sale. She kept her voice level. Prewitt isn't an easily frightened man. The numbers we gave him are solid. One injury doesn't undo that. It gives Caleb a story. He already has a story, she said. He's had several stories. None of them have landed the way he wanted because the facts keep disagreeing with him. She paused. We need to make sure this fact disagrees with him too. How? He said. I can't work the ranch on a broken leg. No, she said. I can. He was quiet. Billy and Amos are good workers, she said. I know the operation well enough now to direct it. We've got 6 weeks of spring work before the summer schedule kicks in, and between the 3 of us we can cover it. She met his eyes. But you need to let me run it. Actually run it, not advise it. Full authority to make decisions." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You've had that for a while already." "Not officially," she said. "Officially, if Caleb questions the ranch management, you're the one who made the calls. I want it to be me. I want it on record, understood by Billy and Amos, and documented if necessary, that Eleanor Whitmore ran this operation for the 6 weeks you were down, and that nothing fell apart." "Everything might fall apart," he said. "It won't," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted. "But I know that doing nothing definitely falls apart, and trying has a better outcome distribution." She looked at him. "Let me try." He closed his eyes for a moment. She felt the wince he was controlling move through his arm under her hand. "All right," he said. She hadn't actually been certain he'd say yes. The relief that moved through her was significant, and she didn't examine it too carefully. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "It's still 6 weeks of mountain spring work." "I'm aware," she said, and she heard him exhale something that was almost a laugh. By the time they got to the ranch, Amos had the bunkhouse cot set up, but Nathaniel refused it with a brevity that suggested the subject was not open for discussion, and Eleanor decided this particular battle was not the one to fight, and they got him into the main house and onto his own bed instead. The doctor from Silver Creek arrived the following afternoon, a long, cold ride, for which Eleanor paid with the ranch's money without consulting Nathaniel, because he was sleeping and the leg needed setting properly, and some decisions simply needed to be made. The doctor's name was Harmon Gale. He was 60 years old and competent in the unhurried way of a man who had been practicing in mountain territory long enough that very little surprised him. He examined the leg, examined Eleanor's splint, and said without particular emphasis, "Good work on the field splint. Clean and correctly placed." "I've only seen it done once," Eleanor said. "Apparently once was enough." He got out his proper supplies and looked at her. "You're the woman from Ohio." "Yes." "You're the one who went to see Elias Pruitt at the bank in March." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Elias mentioned it," Gale said. "He mentioned the accounts where his exact word was immaculate." Something moved in Eleanor's chest. She kept her expression neutral. "The accounts are honest. Same thing generally in my experience." He started working on the leg, and Nathaniel woke up partway through the process with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and Eleanor stayed at the bedside because she'd decided to stay, and nobody had suggested she shouldn't. Gale said, 6 weeks, maybe 8. Full weight on it at 6 if the healing goes clean. No riding before that. "The ranch," Nathaniel started. "Will be managed," Eleanor said. Gale glanced at her, glanced at Nathaniel, made the unobtrusive assessment of a man who paid attention for a living. "I reckon it will," he said mildly, and finished his work. Caleb arrived 3 days later. Eleanor was in the yard directing Billy and Amos on the rotation of the spring cattle when she heard the horse on the road, and she turned to look, and she felt the specific quality of tiredness that came from having anticipated something unpleasant for long enough that its actual arrival was almost a relief. He rode into the yard with that easy seat of his and took in the scene, Eleanor in her work coat, giving instructions. Billy making notes, Amos already moving toward the north pasture, and his face did its recalibrating thing. "Eleanor," he said. Dropped the Mrs. Whitmore now, she noticed. First name, a small assertion of something. "Caleb," she said. "I heard about Nathaniel." He swung down from his horse, and his face arranged itself into appropriate concern. "How bad is it?" "He's recovering well," she said. "The leg will heal clean. 6 weeks." 6 weeks. He nodded slowly, letting that sit. "That's a long time for a ranch this size to be without its owner managing things." "The ranch is being managed," she said. "By you." "By me," she agreed. "And by Billy and Amos, who between them have more combined years of mountain ranching experience than most people in this county." Caleb looked around the yard, something working behind his eyes that he was keeping off his face with the careful maintenance of a man who'd practiced it. "Can I see him?" he said. "He's resting. He's my brother. He's resting, she said again. You can see him this afternoon. He typically wakes up around 3. She held his gaze. You're welcome to wait. He waited, and she went back to work, and she was aware of him watching her from the porch where he'd settled himself, and she let him watch, because she was doing exactly what she would have been doing if he weren't there, and that was the only statement she needed to make. When 3 o'clock came, and she went inside, Caleb followed. Nathaniel was awake, propped up on pillows, looking significantly better than he had 3 days ago, and significantly worse than he would prefer. He looked at his brother in the doorway, and something moved through his expression that Eleanor had learned to read as the controlled management of a complicated history. Caleb, he said. Nate? Caleb came in, sat in the chair by the bed, and for 10 minutes they talked like brothers, carefully around the edges of things, with the surface language of concern and the subtext of everything that had gone wrong between them over years that Eleanor didn't fully know. She stood near the window and did not pretend to be elsewhere. Then Caleb said, You need to think about what happens if the recovery takes longer than 6 weeks. It won't, Nathaniel said. You can't know that. And if it does, this ranch needs real management, Nate, not... He paused, and the pause was precisely calculated. Not a woman who's been here 6 months learning as she goes. Nathaniel said without heat. She fixed the south fence in a blizzard, and the bank accounts in 2 months, and my leg on a mountainside. What exactly is your standard for real management? Caleb's pleasant expression flickered. I could come up, he said. Help out while you're healing. No, Nathaniel said. Nate. No, Caleb. And it was quiet, and it was absolute, and it landed in the room like a boulder. Eleanor is running the ranch. Billy and Amos are working it. You are not needed here. A silence that had edges. Caleb stood. He looked at Eleanor, and for a moment the pleasant expression was entirely gone, and she saw what was underneath it. Not anger exactly, but something colder than anger. The expression of a man doing arithmetic and finding the numbers disagreeable. You've got her well trained, he said to Nathaniel. The room went very still. Nathaniel's voice when he spoke was quieter than before, which was how she'd learned meant he was angrier than before. Get out of my house, Caleb. I'm just saying. I heard what you said. Nathaniel's eyes didn't move from his brother's face. And I'm telling you to get out. Caleb left. Eleanor stood at the window and listened to his horse leave the yard at a pace that said everything about his mood. And then she turned around, and Nathaniel was looking at the ceiling with a jaw set so hard she could see the muscle working. He's not done, Nathaniel said. No, she agreed. He's going to do something direct this time. He looked at her. He's been building up to it since December, and I just shut the door on the easy version. He'll try something harder now. I know, she said. Eleanor. I know, she said again more gently. Rest. I have cattle to rotate. She went back out to the yard and back to work, and she held what Nathaniel had said in the back of her mind the way you hold a weather warning, not with panic, but with the steady attention of someone who understands that the storm isn't if it's when. The when arrived sooner than she'd expected. It arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after Nathaniel's fall, on the kind of bright spring morning that made the mountains look like they were performing cheerfulness. Eleanor had just finished the morning livestock check with Amos and was heading back toward the house when she saw the wagon coming up the road. 2 men in it. One was Hollis Greer from the general store. The other, she didn't recognize, a man in a town suit holding a leather case across his knees. She stopped walking and waited. Greer climbed down from the wagon with the self-important energy of a man who has been given a role he feels he deserves, and the suited man followed with the more contained energy of someone who is here to do a job and has mixed feelings about the company he's keeping. Mrs. Whitmore, Greer said. The way he said it managed to convey that he found the title faintly ridiculous. This is Mr. Andrew Blythe from the Territorial Land Office. Eleanor looked at Blythe. Blythe looked at Eleanor. He had the careful, neutral expression of a bureaucrat who has learned that people are always unhappy to see him and has made his peace with that. Ma'am, he said. Mr. Blythe, she said. "What can I do for you?" "There's been a petition filed," Greer said, clearly enjoying this more than anyone with good character would, "regarding the management status of this property while the primary deed holder is incapacitated." Everything in Eleanor went very still. "A petition filed by whom?" she said. "A concerned community member," Greer said. "Caleb Carter," she said flatly. Blythe's neutral expression didn't change, which told her everything she needed to know. "The petition requests a management review," Blythe said. "Standard procedure when a property deed holder is unable to manage their holding and the de facto management has passed to a party without formal legal standing." He said it carefully, without pleasure. "I'm here to conduct a review of ranch operations and financial management to determine whether the property requires oversight." "Oversight," she said. "A temporary manager," Greer supplied helpfully. "Appointed by the land office to make sure things are done proper." She looked at him. Then she looked at Blythe. "Mr. Blythe," she said, "how long does this review take?" "Typically 2 to 3 days," he said. "I'll need to examine the accounts, speak with the ranch workers, and assess the overall operational status of the property." "Then come inside," she said. "The accounts are on the desk." Greer looked surprised. He'd expected resistance, she realized. Some kind of confrontation that he could report back to Caleb as evidence. She'd decided on the walk from the livestock pen to this conversation that she wasn't going to give him that. You're cooperating," Greer said. "I'm cooperating fully," she said, "because I have nothing to hide and everything is exactly where it should be." She looked at Blythe again. "Every ledger, every receipt, every documented decision since I took over formal ranch management 12 days ago. You're welcome to spend as long as you need." Blythe nodded once. "Thank you, ma'am." She brought them inside. Nathaniel heard voices from his room and called out, and she went in and told him in a low, quick voice what was happening, and she watched the anger move through his face like a wave. "He filed a petition," Nathaniel said. "Yes?" "That son of a Nathaniel." She kept her voice quiet. "I need you to stay in this room and rest." "Like hell I will, Nathaniel." She looked at him directly. "If you come out of that room on a broken leg to argue with a territorial land officer, it will look like exactly what Caleb wants it to look like. An incapacitated man who can't accept he's incapacitated." She held his gaze. "Let me handle this. This is what we've been preparing for." He looked at her for a long, tight moment. "It's my ranch," he said. "I know," she said. "And when you can walk on it properly, you can run it. Right now, let me." Another silence. Longer. "All right," he said. The 2 words came out like they cost him something. She understood that. They'd cost her nothing to say and everything to mean, and she thought perhaps that was the difference between them in this moment, and perhaps that difference was exactly what was needed. She went back out to the desk. Blythe worked methodically. He was, she discovered over the next several hours, genuinely good at his job, the kind of man who looked at numbers the way Eleanor looked at numbers, with patience and specificity, and the particular pleasure of a mind that liked things to add up correctly. He went through the ledgers from the beginning. He looked at the original state of the accounts, which she'd documented carefully, and the corrected version, and the receipts behind every change, and the spring sale records, and the rotation schedules, and the worker documentation. Greer hovered in the background and became progressively more uncomfortable as the hours passed because Blythe was not finding what the petition had implied he would find. And that discomfort was the most satisfying thing Eleanor had experienced in weeks. At one point, Blythe said without looking up from the ledger, "When did you correct the sale timing?" "First week of November," she said. "I identified the pattern from the historical data in the existing ledger and discussed the adjustment with Mr. Carter. The spring sale was the first application of it. The $40 premium." "Yes." He wrote something in his notebook. "And these worker hours." He indicated a column. "You've been keeping daily logs since you took over operational management." "Since my first week on the property, actually," she said. "Different format before, but the same data. Worker hours, tasks, completed, supplies used. She pulled out the earlier notebooks from the desk drawer. I can give you the whole record if you want it. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at Eleanor. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a professional recognition that she understood and respected. I think this is comprehensive, he said. I tried to make it so, she said. Amos and Billy both spoke with Blythe separately in the yard. Eleanor didn't try to be present for those conversations. The accounts could speak for themselves, and so could Amos and Billy, and hovering over them would have suggested she didn't trust them, which she did entirely. Amos came back in afterward and refilled his coffee cup without looking at her and said, I told him you knew this ranch better than most people who'd been born to it. What did he say? She said. He wrote it down, Amos said, and went back out. At the end of the second day, Blythe sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table and closed his notebook. I'll need to write my report, he said, but I want you to know the state of this operation is well above what the petition implied. The accounts are thorough. The documentation is complete. The workers are confident in the current management arrangement. He paused. In my professional judgment, there is no basis for the appointment of an outside manager. Eleanor breathed. Thank you, Mr. Blythe, she said. I'll be recommending the petition be dismissed, he said. I should also tell you... He stopped. Looked like he was deciding something. The petition was filed with a letter of support from Caleb Carter. It contained some characterizations of your management that were not supported by what I found here. I'm not surprised, she said. He characterized you as an opportunist, Blythe said. A woman who had used a vulnerable man's loneliness for her own security and was now using his incapacity to seize control of an asset she had no legitimate claim to. The words landed in the room. Eleanor sat with them for a moment. She'd known Caleb was doing this. She'd known the shape and the direction of it for months. But hearing the specific language of it was different from understanding it abstractly. It was different to hear laid out plain the story someone had constructed about who she was and what she was doing here, knowing that every word of it was designed specifically to be the most damaging version of her possible. That's his characterization, she said. Yes, Blythe said. And the accounts don't support it. He met her eyes. I write what I find, Mrs. Whitmore. I found a well-managed ranch operation and an honest set of books. He left the next morning. Greer had left the evening before wordlessly, with the tight-faced energy of a man who had come expecting a particular result and was returning without it. Eleanor went into Nathaniel's room and sat in the chair by the bed and told him everything. The same way she always told him things in order without drama, fact followed by fact. When she was done, Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Caleb called me vulnerable, he said finally. Yes. In a legal document. Yes. Another silence. He must be more desperate than I thought, Nathaniel said. He's out of legitimate options, she said. The bank is satisfied. The land office is satisfied. The petition failed. She looked at him. He has one move left. What's that? He has to come after me publicly, she said. Stop working behind closed doors and make the accusation directly in front of people where it becomes a social question rather than a legal one. She paused. He knows the town's opinion of me was never strong to begin with. He knows some people still have doubts. If he can make the accusation loud enough and public enough, he can poison the well even if he can't take the land, Nathaniel said. Yes. He looked at her. And you think he'll do it? I think he's out of every other option, she said. So yes, I think he'll do it. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She watched him thinking the way he always thought thoroughly, without rushing, without trying to perform the thinking for an audience. Then he said, When he does, I want to be standing. Your leg. I'll be standing, he said. I need to be walking by then. How long has it been since Gail said 6 weeks? She counted. 4 weeks tomorrow. 2 weeks, he said. I can work with 2 weeks. You're not supposed to... Eleanor. He looked at her steadily. Some things a man needs to stand up for. She looked at him, at this man who had walked through a crowd of cruel laughter and taken his hat off and said 2 words, and who had said "we" instead of "I" since November, and had put his ranch in her hands without requiring her to ask twice, and who was lying in bed with a broken leg talking about standing up. She thought, I am in significant trouble. Not the Caleb kind of trouble. The other kind. The kind that sneaked up on you while you were learning to ride a difficult horse and correcting disorganized ledgers and sitting beside a man in a wagon with your hand on his arm, and you didn't notice it was happening until you were already well into it. She stood up. I'll see what Amos thinks about the North Pasture rotation, she said. Eleanor. She was at the door. Thank you, he said. For all of it. She didn't turn around because she wasn't sure what her face was doing right now, and she'd rather manage that privately. I'll have supper ready at 6, she said, and went back out to the yard. She was halfway to the barn when Amos fell into step beside her with his unhurried, joint-careful walk and said without preamble, Greer's back in town. Already, she said. Rode past the lower gate an hour ago, moving fast. She thought about that. He's telling Caleb, she said. Reckon so, Amos said. And Caleb will. She stopped, because there was another horse on the road, coming up fast, not from town, from the east, from the direction of the lower county road that connected Silver Creek to 3 other small communities and eventually to the territorial seat. It was a rider she didn't recognize. He pulled up at the gate, and she went to meet him, and he was young, barely 20, with a delivery bag over his shoulder, and the efficient manner of a man who had covered a lot of ground today. Carter Ranch, he said. Yes, she said. Letter for Nathaniel Carter, he said. From the territorial seat. Marked urgent. He dug it out of his bag. Came by wire first, they said, to bring the full letter same day. She took it. She looked at the seal on the envelope. Her chest went cold. Not the ranch deed. Not the bank. The territorial seat. She had not seen this coming. She went inside. She went to Nathaniel's room. She held out the letter. He looked at her face before he looked at the envelope. Whatever he read in her expression made him sit up straighter despite the leg. What is it? He said. I don't know, she said. Open it. He opened it. She watched him read. She watched the color leave his face, and then come back, and then settle into something hard and determined. He looked up at her. Caleb filed a second petition, he said. Not to the land office, to the territorial court. His voice was very controlled. He's filed a motion claiming that I lack the mental capacity to manage my own affairs. That the fall was the result of impaired judgment. That I've been making unsound decisions. He stopped. Set the letter down. He's asking a territorial judge to appoint a court-authorized administrator for the ranch property, on the grounds that I'm unfit. The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the letter. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at the window where the mountains were doing their constant, magnificent thing of simply existing with absolute indifference to human catastrophe. Then she said, When is the hearing? 3 weeks, he said. In Silver Creek. Territorial Circuit Judge comes through Silver Creek in 3 weeks, he said. Yes. She stood up. Then we have 3 weeks, she said. Eleanor. 3 weeks is enough, she said. But we need to move now. She went to the desk and picked up the most recent ledger. Then she put it down and looked at him. Nathaniel, who in this town knows you best, who has watched you manage this ranch for years and can speak to your capacity? He thought. Amos, Doc Gale, Prewitt at the bank. And Louisa Pratt, she said. He looked at her. You know Louisa. We've had an understanding for a few months, she said. She knows this town. She knows what people say and what they'll say in a different context. She knows the difference between Caleb's version of this story and the truth. She picked up her coat. I'm going to town. Now, she said. Before Greer gets to Caleb and Caleb gets ahead of this. I want to talk to Prewitt. I want to talk to Gail. I want Louisa to know what's coming." She put her coat on. "This is going to court. That means it's going public. And if it's going public, we need to be ready." Nathaniel looked at her with that expression she'd been learning all these months, the one she'd finally named as recognition, and underneath it now something warmer, something that sat in her chest when she let herself feel it, and was very large, and not at all manageable. "You're going to fight it," he said. "Did you think I wasn't?" she said. A pause. "No," he said. "I suppose I didn't." She was at the door when he said quietly, "Eleanor." She stopped. "Be careful," he said. She looked back at him. At the man who'd walked through a crowd for her 6 months ago, with his hat in his hands, and 2 words that changed the direction of her life. "Always," she said, and she rode down the mountain toward Silver Creek, with the cold spring air against her face, and the full clear weight of what was coming. And she did not flinch, and she did not slow down. And the mountains held their position above her, like they'd been doing since before any of this mattered. And Eleanor Whitmore rode into town like a woman who had already decided how this was going to end. She reached Prewitt's bank before the afternoon light faded. The clerk at the front desk started to say the manager was unavailable, and Eleanor walked past him with the focused energy of a woman who had ridden 4 miles down a mountain in cold air and was not in any mood for bureaucratic courtesy, and she knocked on Prewitt's office door and opened it without waiting for an answer. Prewitt looked up from his desk. He took in her expression. He said, "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore." She sat. She put the letter on his desk. She let him read it. He read it twice. She could tell because his eyes went back to the top of the page when he finished the first pass, the way a careful man reads something that surprises him, not because he missed anything, but because he wants to be certain he didn't. He set it down. "Caleb Carter," he said. "Yes." "He filed this with the territorial court." 3 weeks from now," she said. "Circuit judge." Prewitt folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been in banking long enough to have seen a great many versions of this kind of maneuver. "This is a competency petition. The legal standard for succeeding is significant. He would need substantial evidence that Nathaniel Carter cannot manage his own affairs. He has a broken leg and a woman running his ranch," Eleanor said. "He's going to argue that both of those things are evidence of impaired judgment. The leg because Nathaniel put himself in a dangerous position. Me because," she paused, "because I am who I am, and Caleb has been building that case for 6 months." Prewitt was quiet for a moment. "He came to see me in February," he said. "Caleb, after you and I spoke in March." Eleanor looked at him. "I didn't know that." "He presented a different version of the accounts," Prewitt said. "A version that suggested irregularities. I reviewed them against what you'd brought me, and found the irregularities were creative interpretation of entries rather than actual problems." He said it in the flat, precise tone of a man describing something that had offended him professionally. "I told him I was satisfied with the Carter Ranch's account management and that further inquiries along those lines would need to be substantive rather than speculative." "He didn't tell me that," Eleanor said. "I imagine not." Prewitt looked at the letter on his desk. "I will testify at that hearing," he said, "if you need me. The accounts are clean, the spring sale results are documented, and I can speak to the financial management of this property with complete confidence." Eleanor felt the ground steady beneath her, just slightly, the way it steadied when you found the first solid foothold on uncertain terrain. "Thank you," she said. "It's not charity," Prewitt said in a tone that made clear he needed her to understand that. "I don't give testimony as a favor. The Carter Ranch accounts are sound, and I will say so under oath because it is accurate." "I know," she said. "That's why I came to you." He almost smiled. Not quite. She left his office and went directly across the street to find Gail. The doctor was finishing an afternoon visit to a patient 2 doors down from his office, and Eleanor waited outside, and when he came out she told him in 3 sentences what was happening. He listened with his hands in his coat pockets and his face doing the same careful, unhurried processing it did everything. "I'll testify," he said, before she'd asked. Nathaniel Carter's cognitive state is unimpaired. His judgment the day of the accident was sound-checking a fence line after a thaw is exactly what a responsible rancher does. The ground gave way. That's terrain, not incapacity. He paused. "I'll also speak to the quality of the field splint if it's useful. A woman who can produce that under pressure on a mountain slope is not a woman exercising inappropriate influence over a vulnerable man." "Will you say that to a judge?" she said. "I just said it to you," he said. "I can repeat myself." She found Louisa Pratt in the shop closing up for the evening, and Louisa listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then stood very still for a moment, with her hands on the counter and her jaw set. "He has no shame at all," Louisa said. "He has plenty of ambition," Eleanor said, "which serves the same function." "What do you need?" Eleanor looked at her. "I need the town to know what this actually is," she said. "Not from me, I'm too close to it, and people will say I'm self-interested. I need people who've watched this from the outside to understand that Caleb Carter didn't file a competency petition because he's worried about his brother. He filed it because he wants the land, and every legitimate avenue has been closed to him." Louisa looked at her for a long moment. "You know," she said, "when you first got off that train, I was one of the people who didn't say anything. Didn't laugh, but didn't say anything either." She picked up a bolt of fabric and began putting it on the shelf. "I've thought about that a fair amount since November." "Louisa." "I'm not asking for absolution," Louisa said briskly. "I'm explaining why I'm going to do what I'm about to do." She looked at Eleanor squarely. "I know 8 women in this town who know what Caleb Carter actually is because their husbands have done business with him and come home with shorter bank accounts and longer faces. And I know 4 men who will say plainly and publicly that Nathaniel Carter is the most clear-headed rancher in this county and always has been." She set down the fabric. "I'll have conversations. The right kind." Eleanor rode back up the mountain in the dark. She had never ridden in full dark before she came to Colorado. In Ohio, it wasn't done by women, or wasn't done by women like her. The categories of prohibition had always been somewhat layered, and she'd learned to stop parsing them. Now she rode in mountain dark with the ease of someone for whom the road had become memory, and she thought about the 3 weeks ahead and what they needed. And by the time the ranch lights appeared around the bend, she'd organized it into a list in her head. Prewitt Gale Louisa, the documented accounts, the land office report, and Nathaniel on his feet. Nathaniel. On his feet. She stabled Consequence and went inside and found him at the kitchen table. He was sitting at the kitchen table, not in bed, not propped against pillows. At the table with his splinted legs stretched out before him and his survey map and a cup of coffee with the expression of a man who has made a decision and intends to live with the consequences. "You're not supposed to be out of bed," she said. "I've been in bed for 2 weeks," he said. Gale said no riding, Nathaniel said. "He didn't say no kitchen table." He looked at her. "How'd it go?" She sat down across from him. Told him all of it. Prewitt, Gale, Louisa. He listened the way he always listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You did all that in 2 hours, he said. "Time moves differently when something needs doing," she said. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, and it made his face warm and specific, and she had been careful for months about letting herself look at him too directly in quiet moments like this because of what happened in her chest when she did, and she was still being careful, but it was increasingly difficult work. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "You're going to say something about being grateful," she said, "or something about not knowing what you'd do. And I need you to understand that I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, and because this ranch is worth protecting, and because Caleb Carter is a liar, and I don't tolerate liars, not because I need gratitude." He looked at her steadily. "I was going to ask," he said, "what you actually want, out of this, out of being here." A pause. "You've never said directly." She hadn't. She'd answered the question sideways in actions in the daily accumulation of work and presence, and the 6 months of showing up. She hadn't said it directly, because saying it directly required a kind of courage she'd found easier to apply to horses and fence posts and confrontational bank visits than to sitting across a kitchen table from a man who'd started to matter. I want... She stopped, started again. I want what I came here for, what your letter said. Someone to survive beside. She looked at him. I've been doing that. I want to keep doing it. He looked at her for a long time. So do I, he said. The words were simple, and he meant them the way he meant all words, completely without ornamentation, and Eleanor sat with them and let them mean what they meant. Then we have a hearing to win, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the most organized period of Eleanor's already considerably organized life. She ran the ranch and built the case simultaneously, which meant she was working from before sunup to well past sundown and sleeping less than was strictly advisable, but the body she had found was remarkably cooperative when the work mattered enough. The accounts were already immaculate. She made them more so. She wrote a clean summary, not for the judge, not formally, but for anyone who needed to understand the ranch's financial arc quickly and clearly, where it had been in October, what had changed, why, what the results were documented at every step. She wrote down every decision she'd made since Nathaniel's injury. Every cattle rotation, every supply order, every worker direction. Date, rationale, outcome. 12 days of ranch management in writing so clear it could be read by someone who'd never set foot on a ranch and understood, without question, that the operation was being handled. Billy watched her working on it one evening and said with the slightly stunned expression he sometimes got, "You're making a record of everything." "Yes," she said. "In case the judge asks." "In case anyone asks," she said. Caleb's argument is that this ranch is being mismanaged by someone who doesn't belong here. I intend for there to be documentation of every single day that proves otherwise. Billy was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why didn't you just, when Caleb first started, why didn't you leave? It would have been easier." She looked at him. "Because easier isn't the same as right," she said. "And because I'm tired of leaving things, because other people made them difficult." She picked up her pen. "I spent 27 years leaving things. I'm done with it." Billy nodded slowly. Then he said, "For what it's worth, Amos and me, we'll say whatever needs saying, to the judge or anybody else." She looked at the young man across the desk, with his bandaged hand mostly healed now and his earnest, uncomplicated face. "I know you will," she said. "Thank you, Billy." He went red around the ears and went back to the bunkhouse, and Eleanor went back to her documentation, and the days moved. Nathaniel got off the crutches on day 16. He was not supposed to. Gail had said 4 more days at minimum. But Eleanor came in from the morning cattle check to find him standing in the kitchen without the crutches and testing his weight against the floor with a controlled, deliberate focus that said he'd been working toward this privately and had reached the conclusion the leg was ready whether the doctor agreed or not. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Don't," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "You were thinking it." "I was thinking," she said carefully, "that you have 2 days before the hearing, and you need to be able to stand for most of it, and if you push too hard now, and the leg doesn't cooperate—" "It'll cooperate," he said. "Nathaniel." "Eleanor." He looked at her directly. "I need to be standing when that judge looks at me. Not for the judge, for me." He paused. "A man who lets someone else fight his battles from a sickbed while his woman stands up in front of a court." "I'm not standing up in front of a court," she said. "Prewitt and Gale are. I'm just the evidence." "You're not just anything," he said. The way he said it stopped her entirely. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him standing at the table on his own 2 feet, with his jaw set, and his eyes direct, and the full, complicated weight of 6 months between them. And she thought with absolute clarity, "I am not leaving this man. I am not leaving this ranch. I will not be moved from this by Caleb Carter, or the territorial court, or the entire collected opinion of Silver Creek, Colorado. Be careful with the leg, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went back out to the cattle. The day of the hearing came on a clear, cold Thursday morning in early May, with the mountains doing their enormous thing above Silver Creek, and the town filling up in the way small towns fill up for events, not rushing, but gathering people, finding reasons to be near the courthouse at the relevant time without committing to the specific vulnerability of saying they were there to watch. The circuit judge was a man named Aldous Crane. He was 55, compact, with a face that had been made by decades of listening to people lie under oath, and had developed an expression accordingly not cynical, exactly, but equipped. He set up in the Silver Creek Courthouse, which was also the town hall, and on Sundays the Overflow Church, and he called the hearing to order at 10 in the morning. Caleb was there. Eleanor had known he would be. He sat at one side of the room with a lawyer he'd brought in from the county seat, a thin man named Whitfield, who had the air of someone very expensive being deployed for a purpose he found slightly beneath him. Caleb had dressed carefully. His pleasant smile was in full operation. He caught Eleanor's eye across the room and gave her a small measured nod that was performing civility over something that wasn't civil at all. She looked away. Nathaniel stood beside her, actually stood, on both feet. Upright and solid and present, with the slight controlled quality in his bearing that she'd learned meant he was managing pain, but had made his peace with it. He'd dressed carefully too, in the way of a man who doesn't dress carefully often, and so makes it count when he does. And he looked exactly like what he was, a man of this county, of this land, of this particular mountain, in this particular territory, who had been here long before his brother decided his property was worth taking. She put her hand briefly on his arm. He covered it with his hand for just a moment. Then they both looked forward. Whitfield opened for Caleb with the smooth competence of a man who had done this many times. He laid out the case cleanly. Nathaniel Carter, a rancher of diminished judgment evidenced by a preventable accident, had allowed an unqualified woman with no legal standing to assume control of a significant property. The woman in question had arrived as part of an informal domestic arrangement, had no formal credentials, and had systematically isolated Nathaniel from his family and community support, while accumulating influence over his finances and decision-making. The petition sought the appointment of a court-authorized administrator to manage the property until Nathaniel Carter's capacity could be properly evaluated. Every word was technically accurate. Every word was designed to sound like concern while functioning as a weapon. Eleanor sat and listened, and kept her hands still in her lap, and her face completely composed, because Caleb was watching her, and had been watching her, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her react. Judge Crane listened without expression, and without. When Whitfield finished, Crane looked at the respondent's side of the room. Nathaniel had not hired a lawyer, a decision Eleanor had both questioned and ultimately deferred to, because he'd said plainly that he wasn't going to pay a man to tell his own story for him, and she'd understood that and couldn't argue with it. Mr. Carter, Crane said, you're responding to this petition yourself. Yes, Your Honor, Nathaniel said. You have that right, Crane said in a tone that made clear he'd seen this approach go badly before, but was making no predictions. I'll hear from your witnesses first, then from you. Prewitt went first. He carried the ledgers, all of them, the full stack, and he laid them on the table, and he testified with the dry, precise authority of a banker who had spent 30 years being professionally correct about numbers. He walked through the accounts from the state they'd been in when Eleanor arrived to their current condition. He walked through the spring sale results. He addressed directly, and without being asked, the suggestion that there had been irregularities, explained what had actually been there, explained why it wasn't irregular, explained what Caleb had tried to characterize as fraud, and why that characterization did not hold up under examination. Whitfield tried to cross-examine him. He tried 3 different angles on the same essential point that Eleanor had access to the accounts, and therefore opportunity for manipulation, and Prewitt answered each one with the same patient iron precision. Numbers were numbers. The receipts existed. The documentation was complete. There was nothing to manipulate toward because everything was accounted for. On the 3rd angle, Crane interrupted. "Counselor," he said, "are you planning to produce documentation of these alleged irregularities, or are we asking the witness to disprove a negative indefinitely?" Whitfield paused. "The petitioner believes the documentation." "Believes isn't documentation," Crane said. Next witness. Gale testified about the accident. About the terrain, about the conditions, about the fact that checking a fence line after a spring thaw was standard ranching practice and not evidence of impaired judgment in any professional medical or practical sense. He testified about Nathaniel's cognitive state, clear, consistent, entirely unimpaired, both before and after the injury. He testified at the end about Eleanor's field splint, and he said what he'd said to her outside his office, that a woman capable of producing that quality of work under those conditions was demonstrating competence, not opportunism. Whitfield tried to suggest that Gale's professional relationship with the Carter Ranch created bias. Gale looked at him. "I've treated half the people in this county," he said. "That's called having a practice. If professional familiarity constitutes bias, you'll need to find a judge who's never met a lawyer." A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter. The kind of sound a room makes when something lands true. Crane didn't suppress it. Then Louisa Pratt stood up. She had not been on the witness list. Crane looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Your Honor," she said with the particular composure of a woman who has decided something and is not going to be moved off it. "I'm not a professional. I'm a shop owner in this town, and I've watched Caleb Carter operate in this community for the past 4 months. I'd like to tell you what I've watched if you'll allow it." Crane looked at Whitfield, who started to object. "I'll allow it," Crane said. "This is a civil proceeding, not a criminal trial. Sit down, counselor." Louisa talked for 7 minutes. She talked about the rumors, specifically what they were, and when they started, and how they moved, and who was carrying them. She talked about the money accusation, and what it had been designed to do. She talked about Caleb's approach to the bank and the land office. She talked about what the town had seen in Eleanor Whitmore over 6 months, not what they'd assumed in the first 5 minutes on the platform, but what they'd actually observed. The fence work, the ledgers, the ride down the mountain in the dark to get to Prewitt and Gale the day the letter arrived. She said toward the end, "I don't know everything about why a woman travels 400 miles to start over. But I know what I've watched this particular woman do, and I know the difference between a person building something and a person taking something." She looked at the judge steadily. "Eleanor Whitmore has been building something. Caleb Carter is the one trying to take it." The room was very quiet. Caleb's pleasant expression had not moved, but something underneath it, had Eleanor could tell some structural support had shifted the way a building's face stays intact, while something internal changes, and the whole thing becomes subtly less sure. Crane looked at the room for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Carter," he said, "anything you want to add before I hear from the petitioner's side?" Nathaniel stood. He stood without leaning, without favoring the leg in any visible way, with the full grounded presence of a man on his own land making a statement about it. "Your Honor," he said, "I've known my brother my whole life. I know why he's here and what he wants. The ranch was my father's, and he believed it should have gone to Caleb because Caleb was more charming and I was more stubborn, and when it came to me instead, Caleb never quite forgave either of us for it." He paused. "That's family business, and it's not the court's problem. What is the court's business is whether I can manage my own affairs." He looked at Crane directly. "I can. I have. And the woman standing beside me has helped me do it better than I've done it in years. Not because I'm weak, because she's competent. There's a difference, and I'd ask this court to see it." He sat down. The silence in the room was the good kind, the kind that meant something had just landed and the room was deciding what to do with it. Crane looked at Whitfield. "Counselor," he said, "your witness." Caleb testified. He testified with all the skill he had, which was considerable. The pleasant manner deployed fully, the concern for his brother genuine sounding to anyone who hadn't spent 6 months watching it operate. He told his version of Eleanor's arrival and the months that followed, And in his version, she was a woman who had obscured her true situation from Nathaniel, who had steadily taken over, who had positioned herself between Nathaniel and the family and community support that should have been available to him. He was good. Eleanor had always known he was good. That was the thing about Caleb. He wasn't wrong about everything. He was just wrong about the meaning of everything. The facts he cited were mostly accurate. The story he built from them was entirely false. When Whitfield finished his questioning, Crane looked at Nathaniel. Cross-examination. Yes, Your Honor, Nathaniel said. He asked his brother 3 questions. The first, Caleb, when did you last help work this ranch? A pause. I've been away. When? Nathaniel said. 1874, Caleb said. 7 years ago, Nathaniel said. Second question. Did you in February of this year present altered account records to Elias Pruitt at the Silver Creek Federal Bank? The room shifted. Whitfield said, Objection, Your Honor, this is... It's a question, Crane said. Answer it, Mr. Carter. Caleb's jaw moved. I presented concerns about certain entries. Did you alter them? Nathaniel said. I reinterpreted. That's a yes, Nathaniel said. He looked at Crane. Your Honor, Mr. Pruitt can verify this. He told me directly. Crane made a note. Third question, Nathaniel said. He looked at his brother. If Eleanor Whitmore were not here, if I were managing this ranch alone and had the accident on the North Ridge, what would you have done? Caleb said nothing. You'd have come up here, Nathaniel said, and you'd have stayed and you'd have managed it, and inside 6 months I'd have signed something I shouldn't have, because you'd have been kind and helpful, and I'd have been grateful and not paying close enough attention. His voice was very controlled. That's what you do, Caleb. That's what you've always done. You wait until someone's down, and then you help them in the direction you want them to go. He sat down. The room was absolutely still. Crane looked at Caleb, who had stopped performing pleasantness, and whose face had settled into something that was tired and cold and more honest than anything he'd shown all morning. Anything else? Crane said to Whitfield. Whitfield looked at his client. Caleb shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. No, Your Honor, Whitfield said. Crane gathered his papers. He was quiet for long enough that the room started to feel it. Then he said, I'm going to rule from the bench because this matter doesn't require extended deliberation. The petition for the appointment of a court-authorized administrator for the Carter Ranch property is denied. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states what the evidence supports. I find no basis, legal, medical, or practical, for the conclusion that Nathaniel Carter lacks capacity to manage his own affairs. I further find that the management of the Carter Ranch during the period in question has been conducted with a level of competence and documentation that would satisfy review under any standard this court applies. He paused. I would also note, he said, and his voice took on the particular quality of a judge who is departing from the formal record into something he intends to say anyway, that the petition appears to have been filed not from concern for the deed holder's welfare, but from an interest in the property itself. I find this troubling. He looked at Caleb. This court will not be used as an instrument of family property disputes dressed in the language of welfare concerns. If I see this petition or anything like it again, I will be taking a harder look at the filer's motivations. He stood. Court is adjourned, he said, and walked out. The room broke open. Not loudly, this was Silver Creek. Not a theater, but in the particular way that rooms break open when something held has been released. Movement, breath, the murmur of voices beginning, people turning to each other with the expression of a community that has just watched something and is deciding what it means. Caleb was already moving toward the door. He passed Eleanor without looking at her. Then he stopped. He turned around, and for the first time since December, the pleasant expression was entirely, completely gone. What was underneath it was just a man who had tried a thing and had it fail, and he looked at Eleanor with the flat, undone eyes of someone who has run out of angles. You won, he said. The truth won, she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You know what the worst part is," he said quietly. "I wasn't even wrong about the ranch. It's a good property. It should have been managed better years ago." He glanced at Nathaniel, who had come to stand beside Eleanor. "You just had to go and find someone who'd actually do it." He left. The door closed behind him. Eleanor stood in the Silver Creek courthouse with Nathaniel beside her and Prewitt across the room, folding his documents back into their case, and Gail talking to Louisa near the window, and a town full of people who had watched all of it, and she felt not triumph exactly. Something quieter than triumph. Something that had more to do with foundation than victory. The specific feeling of a thing built well enough that it held when someone pushed against it. Nathaniel put his hand on her arm. She looked at him. "Leg all right," she said. "No," he said cheerfully. "It's terrible. I'm going to hear about it from Gail for a month." "Worth it." He looked at her. That expression, recognition, and now something more. Something she'd been carefully not naming for weeks, and was no longer going to work very hard at not naming. "Every second," he said. Louisa materialized at Eleanor's elbow with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has decided something and is acting on it before sentiment gets in the way. "Supper at our place tonight," she said. "Both of you. Bernard's already agreed, and he doesn't know yet, but he will." Eleanor looked at her. "Louisa." "You can say no," Louisa said. "But I'll just bring the food up to the ranch. If you do so, you might as well come down." Eleanor thought about the ranch in the late afternoon, and the desk with the ledgers and the mountains outside the window, and the ordinary necessary work of a life being built. She thought, "I'll be back to it tomorrow. It'll wait one evening." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Louisa said for the second time since they'd known each other, and went to get her coat. The walk to Louisa's house across town was the first time Eleanor had walked through Silver Creek, without the particular awareness of being watched and found insufficient. People were still watching. This was a small town. People always watched, but the quality of it had changed. Hollis Greer, coming out of the general store, looked at her and looked away without the habitual contempt that had characterized every previous encounter. A woman she didn't know by name nodded at her with the specific gravity of someone acknowledging something they should have acknowledged before. Nathaniel walked beside her slightly slower than his usual pace, out of concession to the leg he was pretending was fine, and their arms were close enough that they were occasionally touching, and neither of them moved to increase the distance. She thought about Caleb's last words in the courthouse. You just had to go and find someone who'd actually do it. It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say, and she thought it would stay with her not bitterly but as information, about what this place had needed, about what she'd come with. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "I'm thinking about the North Pasture Gate latch," she said. "The cold warped it again last week. We need to refit the frame before summer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor." "Yes. Marry me." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and he looked at her in the main street of Silver Creek in the May evening, with the mountains above them, and the whole town somewhere behind and ahead. And he said it again, not louder, not differently. Just again with the same plain, complete intention. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of the arrangement, not because it's practical, because you know this land now, and I want you on it. Because I can't imagine the desk without you at it, or the kitchen without you in it, or any of it without you." He paused. "Because you're the most capable person I've ever stood beside, and I don't want to stop standing beside you." She looked at him, at the man who had walked through a crowd with his hat off and meant every word of 2 syllables. "Your leg is going to give out," she said, "if we stand here much longer." "Then say yes, and we can keep walking," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Yes," she said. They kept walking, and Silver Creek went about its evening around them ordinary and permanent and entirely changed, and the mountains held their position above the town as they had before. Eleanor Whitmore arrived on a train with 1 suitcase and $17 and a letter in her pocket, and as they would after unchanged, indifferent, magnificent. And Eleanor walked through the town she had fought for and won, and was now finally all the way home. They married on a Saturday in June. 3 weeks after the hearing in the Silver Creek Church with Prewitt and Gail, and Louisa, and her husband Bernard, and Billy, and Amos, and 14 other people who had in their own time and their own way decided that Eleanor Whitmore was someone worth showing up for. It was not a large wedding. Eleanor had not wanted large. She'd spent enough of her life being looked at by crowds and had no particular desire to make a ceremony of it. What she wanted, and she'd told Nathaniel this plainly, the way she told him everything, was something real. Something that meant what it said. She wore a dress Louisa had helped her make from deep green wool, and she carried nothing because she had nothing to carry, and didn't see the point of pretending otherwise, and she walked to the front of that church on her own 2 feet, because she'd walked everywhere on her own 2 feet, and she wasn't about to stop now. Nathaniel was already standing at the front, on both feet. The leg had healed clean, the way Gail had predicted it would, if someone would just give it the time it needed, which Nathaniel had given it precisely as much of as he could stand, and not a day more. He stood straight with his hat in his hands, because he'd already taken it off once for her on a train platform, and he knew the weight of the gesture, and he watched her walk toward him with an expression that was not performed and not managed and not careful, just entirely open, which she had learned was the rarest thing Nathaniel Carter ever gave anyone. She reached the front. She looked at him. "Your leg all right?" she said quietly before the preacher started. "Ask me again in an hour," he said. She almost laughed. She felt it move through her and settle into a smile that she didn't try to compose into anything more appropriate, and he saw it, and the corner of his mouth went. They said their words. Real words. Plain words, the kind that meant what they said and didn't require interpretation. He promised to stand beside her. She promised to stand beside him. The preacher said what preachers say, and the small congregation witnessed it, and Billy in the back row was visibly emotional in the way of young men who feel things fully and are slightly embarrassed about it, which Eleanor found she would remember for a long time. Amos, when it was done, shook Nathaniel's hand and said to Eleanor, "Good," with the economy of a man for whom that word carried everything. She understood. "Good," she agreed. The reception was at Louisa's house, and it lasted 4 hours, and Eleanor ate well and talked to people she hadn't fully talked to before, and found in a few of them the beginning of something that would matter later. The woman whose name she'd never learned, who'd nodded at her after the hearing, came to her at Louisa's table and introduced herself as Martha Calloway, and said without ornamentation, "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Eleanor shook her hand and said, "You're saying it now," and meant it, because the past was the past, and the present was standing in Louisa Pratt's house with a wedding ring and a ranch and a husband who looked at her like she was the thing the advertisement had been about all along. The summer that followed was the best working season the Carter Ranch had seen in years. Eleanor ran the accounts, and Nathaniel ran the cattle, and between them and Billy and Amos, they ran everything else, and the operation moved with the particular efficiency of people who understood each other's strengths and had stopped wasting energy on anything that wasn't the work. The summer sale came in $53 above the spring figure. Prewitt heard about it and sent a brief note that said in its entirety, "Consistent with projections." Well done. Eleanor put it in the ledger as documentation. She also started doing something she hadn't planned. It started with Ada Louisa's cousin, the widow, with 60 acres and the unreliable books. Eleanor had helped her in March without thinking much about it, just because the problem was there and she could solve it. But Ada had told 2 other women, and those 2 women had come to Eleanor separately over the summer with their own account problems. A farm widow whose husband had always kept the books, and who was lost without the system. A young woman newly running her father's homestead after his death, who was terrified of the bank and didn't know why her numbers kept coming out wrong. Eleanor sat with each of them the way she'd sat with Ada, patient-specific without condescension. She showed them not just what was wrong, but why it was wrong, and how to keep it from going wrong again. She showed them what questions to ask at the bank and how to recognize when someone was taking advantage of their unfamiliarity with figures. By September, she had helped 6 women with their accounts. By October, Nathaniel noticed. He noticed because the kitchen table was occasionally occupied by a woman Eleanor was working through a ledger with, and because he'd come in from the north pasture one Tuesday, to find Eleanor and a woman named Clara Hess, whose husband had died in August, leaving her with 120 acres and a loan she didn't fully understand, sitting at the desk with 3 years of Clara's account books spread between them. He made coffee and brought 2 cups over and set them down, and went back out to the barn without saying a word. Clara watched him go. "He does that," she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Clara looked at her. "My husband," she said slowly, "would have come in and told me to finish up because he needed the table." "Nathaniel doesn't need the table," Eleanor said. "He has the barn." Clara looked at Eleanor for a moment with the particular expression of a woman recalibrating something she'd assumed was fixed. "How did you find him?" she said. "I answered an advertisement," Eleanor said. "He said he needed someone with courage. And you had it." Eleanor thought about the train platform and the laughter and the 2 words he'd said with his hat off. She thought about the fence post in Consequence, and the ledgers in March, and the hearing in May, and the green wool dress, and the plain words in the church. "I found out I had it," she said. "There's a difference." That evening, after Clara had gone, Nathaniel came back inside and sat at the table and looked at Eleanor at the desk and said, "You're going to keep doing that." "Probably," she said. "The account work. With women in town." "With women who need it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's good work." "I know," she said. "I'm not telling you to stop." "I know that too." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Were you planning a point?" "No," he said. "I was planning supper if you can stop for an hour." She stopped for an hour. October brought the first cold, and the memory of the first cold a year ago, when she'd been 6 weeks on the ranch and still measuring everything in terms of whether she was going to survive it. She thought about that sometimes, about the woman who'd stepped off the train with 1 suitcase and the knuckle-white grip on the handle and the practiced composure she'd assembled like armor over 27 years of needing it. She thought, I don't need the armor the same way now. Not because the world had gotten kinder. The world was the same world. People still made their first judgments before they had the information to make better ones, and some of them never revised, and Hollis Greer still occasionally looked at her with the residue of his original opinion, even though he'd run out of ways to act on it. The world hadn't changed. She had changed. Or not changed clarified. She'd found out what she was made of when it was required, and the finding out had been permanent. You couldn't unknow that kind of thing about yourself. Caleb did not come back to Silver Creek. She heard through Louisa, who heard through the particular network of small-town information that Louisa had long since mastered, that he'd gone south toward New Mexico territory, and had taken up with a mining speculation outfit that had the enthusiastic backing of several men who would regret it. Eleanor heard this and thought, that tracks, and went back to the accounts. November came, and with it a morning that Eleanor would carry the rest of her life. She was at the desk with the ranch's year-end figures, the best figures the property had produced in the decade of records she'd been able to assemble, when she heard Nathaniel come in from the barn and stop in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. She'd learned his footsteps well enough to know when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "Eleanor," he said. She said. "There's a woman at the gate." She turned around. "A woman," she said. "Young? Maybe 20. She's got a bag and she's on foot and she's been standing at the gate for about 10 minutes not coming in." Eleanor stood up. She went to the window and looked out, and there was a young woman at the gate. Thin, tired-looking, with a bag at her feet, and the particular posture of someone who has made a decision and is not quite sure yet if it was the right one. Standing at the edge of a place she'd come to on purpose and hadn't quite committed to entering. Eleanor recognized it. She recognized it so completely, it moved through her like a physical thing. "I'll go," she said. She put on her coat and walked out to the gate, and the young woman looked up when she heard footsteps, and her face did what faces do when they're trying to appear less frightened than they are that assembled composure that people build when they've needed it for a while. "Ma'am," the young woman said. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced it. I heard in town they said that there was a woman at this ranch who helped with accounts, for women who needed it. Eleanor looked at her. Who told you that? She said. Clara Hess, the young woman said. She said you helped her without making her feel stupid about not knowing. Eleanor thought about what she'd said to Clara in October. I found out I had it. There's a difference. She thought about the desk in the Ohio boarding house where she'd read an advertisement and felt something shift in the train ticket and the mountains she'd never seen and the man who'd said 2 words with his hat off and meant both of them. She thought about how long and improbable the distance was between that woman and this one. Come inside, she said. There's coffee on. The young woman picked up her bag. Her name was Sarah Wren. She was 19, recently widowed by a husband who'd left her 40 acres and a loan structure that was designed, whether by intent or incompetence, to be impossible to manage without help. She'd been in Silver Creek 2 weeks, staying with a distant cousin, trying to understand what she owed, and to whom, and whether the land could be saved. Eleanor sat across from her at the kitchen table and went through it. Not quickly. Specifically. Entry by entry the way she'd learned to do it. Not just solving the immediate problem, but showing the reasoning, because a woman who understood the reasoning could solve the next problem herself. That was the point. That had always been the point. Nathaniel came in midway through, made coffee, for all 3 of them, set the cups down, went back to his survey map at the other end of the table. Sarah watched him with the slightly stunned expression Eleanor had seen on Clara's face in October, the expression of someone recalibrating a fixed assumption. Eleanor kept working. 2 hours later, Sarah Wren had a clear picture of her accounts, a written plan for the loan renegotiation she needed to request from the bank, and 3 specific questions to ask Prewitt that would prevent him. Not that Prewitt was likely to deceive her, but prevention was better than remedy from oversimplifying the terms. Sarah looked at all of it spread on the table in front of her. I can do this, she said, not as a question, as a statement arriving at itself. Yes, Eleanor said. You can. Sarah looked at her. How did you know how to do all this? My mother kept books for 11 years, Eleanor said. I watched her, and I paid attention to everything else I could find because I knew I was going to need it someday. How did you know? Eleanor thought about this honestly. I didn't, she said. I just didn't let myself not know. There's a difference between preparing for a specific thing and simply refusing to be unprepared. She looked at the young woman across the table. You can do that too. You can start now. Sarah Wren left an hour later with her papers organized and her shoulders 3 inches lower than when she'd come in, which was the specific physical expression of a burden redistributed into something manageable. She shook Eleanor's hand at the door and said, Thank you, Mrs. Carter, and it landed differently than Eleanor expected. Not the name itself. She'd been Eleanor Carter for 5 months and was well acquainted with it, but the way Sarah said it, with the particular weight of someone who'd been helped by a person they're going to remember. Eleanor stood at the door after she'd gone and watched her walk down the road toward town. Nathaniel came and stood behind her. She all right? He said. She will be, Eleanor said. He put his hand on her shoulder. She put her hand over his. They stood like that for a moment, looking at the road and the mountains beyond it, and Eleanor thought about all the versions of this story. She hadn't gotten to live the one where she'd stayed in Ohio, the one where she'd gotten off the train in Silver Creek, and turned around, the one where she'd let the laughter on the platform, or Caleb's months of careful work, or the hearing, or any of the 100 smaller moments of resistance, decide for her that she didn't belong here. She thought about all of them and was glad with a deep and specific gladness that none of them were the one she was living. The year turned. The second winter came down off the mountains with less surprise and more familiarity, the way things do when you've survived them once and know their character. Consequence had achieved what Eleanor could only describe as a fully functional working relationship based on mutual respect and clearly established expectations, which was more than she could say for some human relationships she'd observed. Billy's hand had healed completely, and he'd started keeping his own set of notes on the cattle rotation that showed Eleanor thought the early signs of a man who was going to be very good at this work in another 5 years. Amos remained Amos, which was to say exactly what the situation required and nothing more, and Eleanor had come to understand this as its own form of eloquence. The women continued coming, not in large numbers. This was not a flood. It was a trickle, the way trust moves in small communities, person by person, word of mouth, Clara to Sarah to the next woman and the next. By the end of the second winter, Eleanor had worked through accounts with 11 women in the county. She charged nothing for it, which Nathaniel had noted once, and not mentioned again because he understood without being told that some work had a different kind of return. Prewitt mentioned it to her on a supply run in February, with the contained satisfaction of a banker who has watched a problem being solved by someone other than himself. The loan default rate for women-held properties in this county, he said, has dropped significantly in the past year. Has it? She said. I don't think it's coincidental, he said. No, she said. I don't either. He almost smiled. Almost. It was in March, a full year and a half after Eleanor had stepped off the train in Silver Creek, that the letter arrived from Ohio. She almost didn't recognize the handwriting. It had been years since she'd seen it, and the address on the front was wrong. It had been sent first to the Columbus boarding house and forwarded twice before reaching the ranch, but she recognized it in the end. A woman named Ruth, who had lived 2 houses down from Eleanor's childhood home, and who had been in the indistinct way of neighborhood adults, a peripheral figure in Eleanor's growing up. She opened it. Ruth wrote to say she'd heard through a return traveler that Eleanor Whitmore. She used the old name. She didn't know the new one had gone west and was making something of herself in Colorado territory. She wrote to say she was glad. She wrote in the slightly awkward way of someone saying a thing they should have said earlier, and know it that she had always thought Eleanor was capable of more than Columbus had offered her, and she was sorry she'd never said so when it might have mattered more. Eleanor read the letter twice. She sat with it for a while. Then she wrote back. Not a long letter. She'd never been a woman who used more words than the situation required. She thanked Ruth for writing. She told her she was well. She said the mountains were larger than anything she'd imagined before she saw them, and that she'd learned the important things were always larger than you imagined before you got close enough to understand them. She said she hoped Ruth was also well, and that Columbus was treating her kindly. She sealed the letter and set it on the desk to go out with the next mail run. Nathaniel found it there that evening and picked it up to read the address and set it back down. Ohio, he said. Ohio, she confirmed. Someone you knew. Someone I used to know, she said. It's a little different now. He understood that. He understood most things she said, which she had come to believe was not incidental, that it was the specific result of a man who had spent years living quietly enough to hear things clearly. You want to go back sometime, he said. Visit. She thought about Columbus, about the boarding house and the market counter and the mirror on the morning of her 27th birthday. No, she said. He nodded. That was enough. The spring came. The third spring on the ranch, the second full year of their marriage, and Eleanor was 30 years old, and knew the north pasture gate latch, and the behavior of mountain weather, and the specific sound consequence made when she was being cooperative versus the sound she made when she was considering alternatives. She knew the feel of the account books under her hands, and the way the figure columns looked when everything was right, that specific visual satisfaction of a set of numbers that add up to exactly what they're supposed to. She knew the sound of Nathaniel's boots on the porch, and the particular quality of his silence that meant he was working something through, and the different quality that meant he'd worked it through and was ready to talk. She knew this life. And one morning in April, she stood at the window. She'd stood at that first winter, the kitchen window, the one that faced the mountains, and she held a cup of coffee, and she looked at the ranch in the early light, and she felt it. Not triumph, not relief, not the emotional resolution of a thing finally won. Something quieter and more permanent than any of those. She felt at home. Not in the sentimental sense, in the structural sense. The sense of a foundation that had been built by hand, slowly, with actual materials, and had been tested and had held. The sense of a place that knew her weight and had accommodated it, and was not going anywhere. Nathaniel came in from the barn. He stopped when he saw her at the window. She didn't turn around. She said, "The fence line on the east side needs looking at before the spring thaw, the same section as last year." "I know," he said. "And the account books from Clara Hess's cousin came in yesterday. I told her I'd work through them this week." "All right." "And Sarah Wren is coming Thursday. She's got a question about renegotiating the secondary loan terms, and I want Prewitt there if we can arrange it." "I'll send word this morning," he said. She turned around. She looked at her husband, this steady, difficult, honest mountain country man who had put 2 words and a hat removal between her and a train platform she would have walked back to eventually without them. She looked at the desk with the ledgers. She looked at the window with the mountains. She thought about the woman on the train with white knuckles and practiced composure and $17 and a letter in her pocket that said, "I need someone with courage enough to survive beside me." And she thought about everything that had happened since. And she thought about Sarah Wren's shoulders dropping 3 inches in the doorway and Clara Hess saying, "My husband would have needed the table," and Ruth's letter forwarded twice from Ohio. And Amos saying good at her wedding, like it was the complete sentence it was. She thought, "I did not come here to survive. She thought I came here to live, and that is exactly what I have done." Eleanor Whitmore. Carter set down her coffee cup, picked up her coat, and went out to do the work of her life, the life she had chosen, the life she had built, the life she had fought for, inch by inch, and day by day, and word by word until it was solid enough to stand on. And it held her. It held her completely. And that was enough. That was in every way that had ever mattered exactly enough.